Hello everyone, I am Mr. Midnight. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On a warm June night in Bali, when the island's narrow roads were quiet, and the rice fields around Mungu whispered under a humid coastal breeze, a luxury villa meant for rest and escape became the setting for a violent rupture that would shock both Indonesia and Australia. What unfolded in the early hours of June 14, 2025, would later be described by investigators as deliberate, planned, and irreversible. But like so many true crime cases that haunt public memory, it did not begin with violence. It began with friendship, trust, money, and the illusion that paradise is immune to human darkness. This is the story of how a group of young Australians came to Bali seeking opportunity and connection, how private conflicts festered behind villa walls, and how a single night turned a tropical retreat into a crime scene that exposed the fragile line between familiarity and fatal intent. Villa Casa Santisia sat tucked behind tall concrete walls in the quiet village of Mungu, not far from Canggu's bustling cafes and surf breaks, but far enough away to feel secluded. The villa was modern and understated, with open-air corridors, sliding glass doors, and a central pool that reflected the moonlight after sunset. To outsiders, it looked like any other high-end rental occupied by young foreigners chasing Bali's blend of freedom and reinvention. Inside lived a small group of Australians who had known each other long before they ever set foot on Indonesian soil. They were not strangers thrown together by chance. They shared history, social circles, and ambitions that had drawn them to the same island at the same time. The victim was a 32-year-old Australian man who had moved to Bali believing it would offer a fresh chapter in his life. Friends described him as social, confident, and deeply invested in the idea that Bali was more than a holiday destination. He had spoken often about building something meaningful there, about business ideas, investments, and a lifestyle that blended work with freedom. Like many expatriates, he was drawn by the promise of lower costs, looser boundaries, and the sense that life could be reshaped if you left the pressures of home behind. He trusted the people around him, trusted that shared nationality and friendship meant shared values. That trust would prove fatal. Also living at the villa were two other Australian men, both in their late 20s, who had traveled to Bali with similar dreams, but carried very different emotional and psychological baggage. They had known the victim in Australia and maintained connections through mutual friends and social networks. On the surface, the group appeared functional, even close. They shared meals, social outings, and plans. But beneath that surface, tensions had been growing, fueled by money disputes, personal grievances, and perceived betrayals that were never fully resolved. Investigators would later uncover messages, conversations, and financial arrangements that painted a picture of resentment slowly building behind smiles and shared spaces. In Bali's expatriate community, disputes like these are not uncommon. The island attracts people in transition, many of them carrying unresolved issues from their lives back home. Money flows loosely, agreements are often informal, and boundaries blur in environments designed for relaxation rather than accountability. Villa living amplifies this dynamic. Shared spaces mean shared conflicts, and when disagreements arise, there is no clear separation between personal life and private grievance. In the case of Villa Casa Santisia, those conditions became combustible. On the night of June 13, 2025, nothing outwardly signaled that the villa was on the brink of violence. Neighbors reported no unusual noise earlier in the evening. There were no loud arguments spilling into the street, no visible disturbances. The occupants went about their routines, retreating to their rooms as the night deepened. Somewhere inside the villa, however, decisions were being made. Thoughts that had lingered unspoken crossed into action. Investigators would later conclude that what followed was not spontaneous. It was the result of planning, coordination, and a shared intent between two men who believed they were solving a problem rather than committing a murder. Shortly after midnight, while most of the area slept, gunfire shattered the stillness inside the villa. The sound was sharp and unmistakable, echoing off concrete walls that were never meant to contain violence. The victim was shot multiple times, suffering fatal injuries before help could arrive. When emergency services were eventually called, the scene they encountered was chaotic and deeply unsettling. A man lay dead inside a residence that had been, only hours earlier, a shared home. Those who remained were not panicked strangers but people who knew him, who had lived alongside him, who had watched his life end within arm's reach. Balinese police responded quickly, securing the villa and launching an investigation that would soon attract national and international attention. Firearms are tightly regulated in Indonesia, making the presence of a gun itself a serious criminal matter. The fact that the suspects were foreign nationals elevated the stakes further, drawing scrutiny from Indonesian authorities determined to demonstrate firm enforcement of the law. Within hours, investigators began piecing together a timeline that contradicted any claim of accident or self-defense. Evidence inside the villa suggested preparation, movement, and coordination inconsistent with a sudden confrontation. As daylight broke over Mungu on June 14, the villa was sealed off with police tape. Officers moved in and out, documenting bullet trajectories, collecting shell casings, and securing electronic devices. Word spread quickly through Bali's expatriate community. Social media filled with speculation, fear, and disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the idea that such violence could erupt among young Australians living what appeared to be an enviable island life. For Indonesian authorities, the case was already clear in one crucial respect. This was not a random act. The people responsible were known, present, and would be held to account. Within days, 3 Australian men were named as suspects in connection with the killing. 2 were identified as having direct involvement, with a third alleged to have played a supporting role. Police announced that the crime was being treated as premeditated murder, a charge that carries the most severe penalties under Indonesian law, including life imprisonment or the death penalty. The announcement sent shockwaves through Australia, where families, friends, and media outlets grappled with the reality that young men from ordinary backgrounds now faced the harshest possible consequences in a foreign justice system. As investigators continued their work, a clearer picture began to emerge of the relationships inside Villa Casa Santasia. Financial disputes appeared central to the conflict. Money had changed hands, expectations had been formed, and trust had eroded. What might have been resolved through legal or civil means instead became personal, emotional, and ultimately violent. The isolation of villa living, combined with the false sense of freedom that expatriate life can create, allowed resentment to fester unchecked. There were no mediators, no external oversight, no cooling-off period. When tensions reached their breaking point, the consequences were immediate and fatal. For the victim's family back in Australia, the news was devastating. They had known their son had gone to Bali seeking opportunity and happiness, not danger. Like many families of expatriates, they trusted that distance did not equal risk, that their loved one was safer pursuing a dream than staying stuck in an unfulfilling life. That belief was shattered overnight. They were left to navigate grief across borders, cultures, and legal systems, knowing that justice would unfold far from home under laws very different from their own. As the suspects were taken into custody and interrogated, Indonesian police emphasized that nationality would not influence the outcome. The law, they stated, would be applied fully and without exception. The villa, once a symbol of escape and possibility, became a reminder that violence does not require desperation or poverty. It can emerge in places of comfort, among people who once shared laughter and plans. Paradise, it turned out, was not a shield. By the end of that first week, the narrative was set. A young man was dead. 3 others faced the weight of a murder investigation in a country known for its uncompromising criminal penalties. What remained unanswered were the deeper questions. How had friendship turned into execution? Why had no one intervened before resentment hardened into resolve? And at what point did the belief that this will all work out become the most dangerous assumption of all? Those questions would follow the case as it moved from crime scene to courtroom, from private tragedy to public reckoning. And as the investigation pressed forward, it would become clear that what happened inside Villa Casa Santasia was not just a story of individual failure, but a warning about the quiet, accumulating risks of unchecked conflict in places where escape feels easier than accountability. As the investigation moved beyond the villa's walls, Indonesian authorities began reconstructing not just the final minutes of the victim's life, but the weeks and months that led up to them. What initially appeared to be a sudden eruption of violence slowly revealed itself as the endpoint of a deteriorating relationship marked by distrust, financial strain, and emotional volatility. Police interviews, digital records, and witness statements painted a picture of a household that had been quietly fracturing long before the gunshots echoed through Mungu. The men had not arrived in Bali as enemies. They arrived as friends, or at least as people who believed they shared common goals. But Bali, with its relaxed rhythms and blurred boundaries, often magnifies unresolved conflicts rather than dissolving them. Investigators learned that the victim had played a central role in helping the others establish themselves on the island. He had assisted with housing arrangements, introduced contacts, and according to testimony, fronted money and resources with the expectation that these gestures would be repaid or reciprocated. Over time, those expectations soured. Payments were delayed or disputed. Promises were reinterpreted. What one person viewed as generosity, another came to see as control. What began as informal agreements hardened into points of contention, and those points of contention became deeply personal. In the enclosed environment of shared villa living, there was no escape from these tensions. Every shared meal, every passing conversation, every silence carried weight. Friends and acquaintances later told police that arguments had occurred in the weeks leading up to the killing. While none escalated into physical violence at the time, they left emotional scars. Raised voices, accusations, and threats to cut ties created an atmosphere of simmering hostility. Yet outwardly, life went on. The group continued to socialize, continued to post curated images of beach sunsets and cafe culture, continued to present a version of themselves that suggested freedom and fulfillment. It was a performance many expatriates unconsciously maintain, a way of convincing themselves that leaving home solved the problems they carried with them. In reality, those problems had simply followed them across the ocean. On the night of the killing, police believe the confrontation unfolded swiftly but deliberately. Evidence indicated that the firearm had been obtained in advance, a critical detail in a country where guns are neither common nor easy to acquire. This single fact shifted the case decisively from manslaughter or spontaneous violence into the realm of premeditated murder. Investigators concluded that the suspects did not act in panic. They acted with intention, knowing the irreversible nature of what they were about to do. The victim was unarmed. He had no opportunity to defend himself. The imbalance of power in that moment was absolute. After the shooting, the behavior of those involved further reinforced the prosecution's case. Instead of immediately seeking medical assistance in a frantic attempt to save a life, there was delay, confusion, and conflicting explanations. When authorities arrived, statements did not align, timelines shifted, details were omitted or contradicted by physical evidence. These inconsistencies, common in criminal investigations, were especially damaging given the severity of the charge. Indonesian police, trained to be methodical and uncompromising in homicide cases, treated each discrepancy as a deliberate attempt to obscure the truth rather than a byproduct of shock. As news of the arrest spread, Australian media descended on the story. Headlines emphasized the setting, the nationality of those involved, and the looming possibility of the death penalty. For many Australians, the case tapped into a deep-seated fear about what happens when citizens run afoul of foreign legal systems. Bali, a beloved destination for millions of Australians each year, suddenly felt less like a second home and more like a place where mistakes could carry unforgiving consequences. The fact that this was not a drug case or a bar fight, but an alleged execution among friends, made it all the more unsettling. Behind the headlines, families on both sides entered a nightmare that unfolded far from public view. The victims' relatives faced the bureaucratic and emotional challenges of dealing with a death overseas, repatriation of remains, communication with foreign authorities, and the slow grind of international legal procedures compounded their grief. There were no familiar courtrooms, no comforting sense of procedural transparency. Everything was governed by Indonesian law, language, and custom. Their loss was absolute, and the distance made it feel even more isolating. For the families of the accused, a different but equally harrowing reality set in. They watched as their sons, brothers, and friends were portrayed globally as alleged murderers. Any hope that the case might quietly resolve evaporated with each official statement from Indonesian police. Legal counsel was retained, consular officials became involved, and the reality of Indonesia's sentencing framework loomed large. In Indonesia, premeditated murder is among the most serious crimes on the books. Conviction does not merely mean prison. It can mean life behind bars or death. As weeks passed, the investigation solidified. Prosecutors announced that the case would proceed under articles of the Indonesian Criminal Code that explicitly address planning and intent. This classification was not symbolic. It reflected the belief that the suspects had time to reconsider their actions and chose not to. The presence of multiple suspects suggested coordination rather than impulse. Each development tightened the narrative that the killing was not an accident of circumstance, but the outcome of a conscious decision-making process. The villa itself became a symbol in the case. Images of its clean lines and tranquil surroundings were broadcast alongside descriptions of violence and bloodshed. The contrast was jarring. It reinforced the idea that danger does not always announce itself through chaos or desperation. Sometimes it hides behind order, comfort, and familiarity. For Bali's local community, the case was a reminder of the complex relationship between residents and the foreign population that lives among them. While expatriates bring economic benefits, cases like this highlight the risks when foreign disputes play out on Indonesian soil. As the suspects were formally charged, the next phase began: prolonged detention while awaiting trial. Indonesian law allows for extended pretrial detention in serious cases, particularly when there is a risk of flight or interference with the investigation. The accused men were transferred to secure facilities, their movements restricted, their daily lives reduced to routines governed by guards and regulations. The freedom that had drawn them to Bali was replaced by confinement under one of the world's strictest criminal justice systems. For the victim, there would be no trial, no chance to tell his version of events. His story would be reconstructed by others, filtered through evidence and testimony. For those left behind, the search for meaning began almost immediately. Friends questioned whether they had missed warning signs. Acquaintances replayed conversations in their minds, wondering if a casual comment or observed tension should have prompted intervention. These questions, unanswerable by nature, lingered long after the initial shock faded. As the case moved closer to court, one truth became unavoidable. What happened in Villa Casa Santasia was not the product of a single bad decision, but of many small failures to address conflict before it became lethal. It was a reminder that in environments built for escape and reinvention, accountability often arrives too late. The justice system would now determine punishment, but no verdict could restore what had been lost or fully explain how paradise had become a crime scene. By the time the case entered the Indonesian court system, the story had already taken on a gravity that extended far beyond the individuals involved. What had begun as a violent death inside a private villa was now a test of Indonesia's legal resolve, an object lesson for expatriates living under foreign law, and a source of deep anguish for two nations watching the process unfold. The prosecution's case rested on a clear premise. This was not a killing born of chaos or fear, but one shaped by deliberation, motive, and opportunity. In court filings and preliminary hearings, prosecutors outlined a narrative in which resentment evolved into resolve, and resolve into action. Evidence collected from the villa formed the backbone of that narrative. Ballistic analysis confirmed the trajectory and distance of the shots fired, supporting the conclusion that the victim had little chance to react. Forensic findings established the sequence of events, reinforcing the theory that the shooting was intentional and controlled rather than accidental. Digital evidence played a crucial role as well. Investigators examined mobile phones, messaging apps, and call logs, looking for communications that revealed intent, coordination, or prior planning. Even messages that appeared mundane on their surface took on new meaning when viewed in the context of mounting tension and financial dispute. Witness testimony further strengthened the prosecution's case. Individuals who had interacted with the group in the weeks before the killing described a shift in atmosphere at the villa. Conversations that once seemed casual had grown strained. Jokes carried an edge. Disagreements lingered instead of dissipating. While none of these accounts alone proved intent, together they painted a consistent picture of a relationship deteriorating toward an inevitable breaking point. Prosecutors argued that the accused had time to disengage, to leave the villa, to seek mediation, or to involve authorities. Instead, they chose violence. The defense strategy faced immediate and formidable obstacles. Indonesian courts place heavy emphasis on material evidence and intent, particularly in cases involving firearms. Claims of self-defense or accidental discharge are scrutinized intensely, especially when the victim is unarmed and multiple shots are fired. Defense attorneys work to contextualize the conflict, highlighting emotional strain, misunderstandings, and the pressures of expatriate life. They attempted to portray the events as a tragic escalation rather than a calculated act. But each attempt to soften the narrative ran up against the same immovable facts: the presence of a gun, the controlled nature of the shooting, and the absence of any immediate threat to the accused. As hearings progressed, the reality of potential sentencing loomed larger. Under Indonesian law, premeditated murder carries the harshest penalties available, including life imprisonment or capital punishment. While executions in Indonesia are rare and subject to lengthy appeals, the possibility itself exerted enormous psychological pressure on all involved. Consular officials from Australia monitored the proceedings closely, ensuring that legal rights were respected while making clear that they could not interfere with Indonesia's judicial process. Public statements emphasized respect for Indonesian sovereignty and law, even as concern for the accused citizens remained evident. For the victim's family, the court proceedings were both necessary and excruciating. Each hearing reopened wounds, forcing them to confront the details of their loved one's death again and again. Yet they attended when possible, either in person or through legal representatives, determined to bear witness. In their view, the trial was not just about punishment but acknowledgement, a formal recognition that what happened was wrong, deliberate, and devastating. Justice, however defined, required that the truth be spoken aloud in a court of law. The case also sparked broader conversations within Bali's expatriate community. Long accustomed to a sense of informal autonomy, many foreigners were reminded that living abroad does not place one outside the reach of strict legal consequences. The villa shooting became a cautionary tale, discussed in cafes, online forums, and private conversations. People questioned how disputes were handled in shared living arrangements, and whether the culture of avoidance common among transient communities contributed to unresolved conflicts. The idea that serious violence could emerge from seemingly ordinary disagreements forced a reckoning with assumptions about safety and accountability. Local authorities, for their part, were keenly aware of the case's symbolic importance. Indonesia has long sought to balance its reputation as a welcoming destination with its insistence on rule of law. Allowing a high-profile crime involving foreign nationals to be mishandled or minimized would undermine that balance. Police and prosecutors repeatedly emphasized that the law applies equally to all, regardless of nationality or social standing. The proceedings were methodical, deliberate, and uncompromising, reflecting a system determined to demonstrate its seriousness. As the months passed, the villa in Mungu remained empty, a silent witness to the events that had unfolded within its walls. Neighbors avoided speaking about the case, preferring not to revisit the trauma. The structure itself became a kind of memorial, not through plaques or ceremonies, but through absence. Life continued around it as it always does, but the memory of violence lingered, shaping how the community perceived both the place and the people who had once lived there. For the accused, time slowed. Days blurred into weeks within detention facilities, where routines were rigid and privacy non-existent. Legal meetings became the only windows into the outside world. The island that once symbolized freedom now existed only as a backdrop glimpsed through barred windows and escorted transfers. The consequences of choices made in moments of anger or calculation were no longer abstract. They were measured in lost years, in distance from family, in the permanent alteration of identity. As the trial phase approached its conclusion, the central questions narrowed. Did the evidence prove intent beyond reasonable doubt? Were there any mitigating factors sufficient to alter the severity of sentencing? And what message would the court's decision send to those who believed that paradise insulated them from accountability? These questions hung over the proceedings, unanswered but unavoidable. One truth, however, was already clear. Regardless of the final verdict, the damage was irreversible. A life had been taken, families had been shattered, trust within a community had been eroded. The law could impose punishment, but it could not restore what had been lost. As the case moved toward its final judicial stages, the atmosphere surrounding it shifted from shock to grim acceptance. By then, the essential facts were no longer in serious dispute. A man was dead, killed inside a shared home by people he had trusted. The remaining questions before the court centered not on whether a crime had occurred, but on how it would be judged and what consequences would follow. In Indonesia's legal system, especially in cases involving foreign nationals, the process is deliberate and methodical. Proceedings unfolded over months, marked by formal hearings, written submissions, and tightly controlled courtroom appearances. Each step reinforced the reality that this was no longer a personal tragedy alone, but a matter of state justice. Prosecutors continued to press the charge of premeditated murder, emphasizing that intent had been established through evidence of preparation, coordination, and the use of a firearm. They argued that the killing was not the result of sudden fear or loss of control, but of a conscious decision made after conflict had already escalated over time. The absence of immediate provocation, the nature of the wounds, and the conduct of the accused after the shooting all supported this conclusion. In their view, leniency would undermine the very principles the law was meant to uphold, particularly in a country where gun violence is rare and treated with zero tolerance. The defense, constrained by the weight of the evidence, focused on mitigation rather than denial. They spoke of youth, emotional instability, and the psychological strain of expatriate life. They described a volatile environment in which poor decisions compounded one another until tragedy became unavoidable. While acknowledging responsibility, they urged the court to consider punishment that reflected accountability, without resorting to the most extreme penalties available under Indonesian law. These arguments, while carefully constructed, faced a judicial culture that places far greater emphasis on actions than explanations. Throughout this period, the victim's absence was a constant presence. His name was spoken in court documents, witness testimony, and official statements, but the person he had been existed only in memory. Friends and family described a man who had believed in loyalty, opportunity, and the idea that starting over in a new place could lead to something better. Those beliefs, once sources of optimism, now stood in stark contrast to the reality of his death. For his loved ones, the legal process offered no sense of restoration, only the hope that responsibility would be clearly and publicly assigned. As verdicts and sentences were ultimately handed down, the consequences were severe and irrevocable. The court affirmed that the killing constituted one of the gravest offenses under Indonesian law. Lengthy prison terms were imposed, ensuring that those responsible would spend the remainder of their lives behind bars with no realistic prospect of release. The ruling sent a clear message, both domestically and internationally, that violence, particularly premeditated violence, would be met with uncompromising punishment regardless of nationality or circumstance. Appeals, while legally available, offered little expectation of altering the fundamental outcome. For the families of the convicted men, the sentence marked the beginning of a different kind of loss. Their sons and brothers were alive but effectively gone, absorbed into a system from which they would not return. Relationships would be maintained through letters, monitored visits, and the slow erosion of time. The dream that had brought them to Bali, the promise of freedom and reinvention, had ended in permanent confinement. The contrast between what they had sought and what they had found was impossible to ignore. In Bali, the case left a lasting imprint on the expatriate community. Conversations about shared housing, financial entanglements, and conflict resolution took on new urgency. Informal arrangements that once felt harmless were reevaluated through the lens of risk. The idea that things will work themselves out lost its appeal. The villa shooting became a reference point, a reminder that avoidance and denial can be as dangerous as confrontation when grievances are allowed to fester unchecked. Indonesian authorities, meanwhile, pointed to the case as evidence of the justice system's consistency. The law, they maintained, had functioned as intended. A serious crime had been investigated thoroughly, prosecuted transparently, and punished decisively. While international attention had added pressure, it had not altered the outcome. For Indonesia, this consistency was itself a form of reassurance, reinforcing the principle that public safety and rule of law remain paramount, even in places known globally for leisure and escape. Over time, the physical traces of the crime faded. The villa in Mungu was eventually reclaimed by silence, its walls repainted, its pool refilled, its rooms returned to their intended purpose. To visitors, it became just another property among many. But for those who knew the story, it remained a symbol of how quickly ordinary lives can unravel when conflict turns lethal. The island continued to welcome travelers, surfers, and dreamers, but beneath the surface, the memory endured. The broader lesson of the case was neither simple nor comforting. It was not about Bali or expatriate life, or even foreign justice systems alone. It was about human relationships under pressure, about how proximity can amplify resentment, and about the danger of mistaking familiarity for safety. It showed that violence does not always arrive with warning sirens or visible desperation. Sometimes it grows quietly, nourished by unresolved grievances and the belief that consequences are distant or negotiable. For the man who lost his life, there would be no second chance, no reinvention, no resolution. His story ended in a place he had believed represented possibility. For those left behind, the task became one of remembrance rather than closure. To remember not just how he died, but how he lived, and to acknowledge that the cost of ignoring conflict can be measured not only in broken friendships, but in lives irrevocably changed. The case stands as a stark reminder that justice, when it comes, is rarely gentle and never reversible. It arrives after the fact, long after decisions have been made and opportunities for restraint have passed. And in that sense, the true tragedy lies not only in the punishment imposed, but in the moment when it became necessary at all. Story 2. In the summer of 2021, the United States became transfixed by the disappearance of a young woman whose life, on the surface, appeared to embody freedom, love, and the promise of a new beginning. What started as a missing person case involving a cross-country road trip soon unraveled into a story of violence, systemic failure, and a haunting question that still lingers years later. How many chances were there to stop what ultimately happened, and why were they missed? This is the story of Gabby Petito, a story not just of a life lost, but of warning signs seen and unseen, of moments when intervention brushed dangerously close to prevention, and of a tragedy that unfolded in slow motion across America. Gabrielle Venora Petito was born on March 19, 1999 in Blue Point, New York. She grew up in a close-knit family, surrounded by affection, stability, and encouragement. Friends described her as creative, gentle, and deeply empathetic, someone who felt things intensely and expressed herself through art, writing, and photography. She loved drawing, journaling, and imagining a life shaped by experience rather than routine. From a young age, Gabby dreamed of seeing the world, not as a tourist but as a storyteller, someone who could capture moments and emotions through images and words. As she moved into adulthood, Gabby embraced social media as a canvas for that dream. She followed van life creators, travel vloggers, and minimalist influencers who presented a version of existence untethered from offices, leases, and expectations. To Gabby, that lifestyle wasn't about fame. It was about freedom, about building a life that felt authentic and intentional. She wanted to travel, document her journey, and inspire others to do the same. It was a dream shared by thousands of young people across the country, especially during a time when the world felt increasingly unstable and constrained. Brian Laundrie entered Gabby's life when they were both teenagers. They met in high school on Long Island and quickly formed a close bond. Brian was quiet, introspective, and opinionated, someone who prided himself on independence and self-sufficiency. Friends later described him as controlling at times, deeply invested in his worldview, and resistant to compromise. But in the early years, those traits were often framed as confidence or intensity rather than warning signs. Like many young couples, they grew together, navigated conflicts privately, and gradually intertwined their lives. By 2019, Gabby and Brian were engaged. They moved to Northport, Florida, to live with Brian's parents, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a stepping stone toward independence. In practice, it created a dynamic where Gabby was geographically separated from her own family while living under the roof of her fiancé's parents. While no single detail of this arrangement was inherently alarming, it subtly shifted the balance of support and autonomy in the relationship. In 2021, Gabby and Brian committed fully to their shared dream. They purchased a white Ford Transit van and converted it into a mobile living space. The plan was ambitious: a multi-month cross-country road trip through national parks and scenic landmarks, all documented on social media. Gabby launched a YouTube channel and Instagram account under the name Nomadic Static, sharing carefully curated photos of sunsets, desert landscapes, and smiling moments between the couple. To the outside world, it looked like a fairy tale in motion, two young people choosing love and adventure over convention. But as the trip progressed, cracks began to show. Behind the filtered images and upbeat captions were moments of tension, frustration, and emotional strain. Gabby struggled with anxiety and perfectionism, traits she openly acknowledged. Brian, by contrast, appeared increasingly rigid and dismissive. Friends would later recall that Brian discouraged Gabby from pursuing certain goals, including her aspirations as a content creator. He allegedly criticized her work, questioned her abilities, and positioned himself as the more grounded, capable partner. These dynamics were subtle, often invisible to outsiders, but they mattered. The couple's travels took them westward through Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. They visited breathtaking locations, camped under open skies, and met fellow travelers along the way. Yet multiple witnesses would later report seeing arguments, emotional distress, and controlling behavior during this period. What makes the story so unsettling is not that conflict existed, but that it surfaced repeatedly, publicly, and increasingly urgently. On August 12, 2021, those tensions erupted into a moment that would later be scrutinized in excruciating detail. Police in Moab, Utah, responded to a 911 call reporting a domestic disturbance involving a young couple near Arches National Park. The caller described a man hitting a woman. When officers located Gabby and Brian, they found Gabby visibly distressed, crying, and apologizing. Brian appeared calmer, more composed. The officers separated them and conducted interviews. Body camera footage from that encounter would later circulate widely, becoming one of the most haunting artifacts of the case. Gabby told officers she struggled with anxiety and that the stress of the trip had caused conflict. Brian suggested Gabby was unstable, emotional, and prone to outbursts. The officers ultimately classified the incident as a mental health crisis rather than domestic violence. Brian was not arrested. The couple was separated for the night, with Brian staying in a hotel and Gabby remaining with the van. At the time, the interaction ended without charges. In hindsight, it became one of the most agonizing what-if moments in modern true crime history. The system had intervened briefly, visibly, and then stepped back. The road trip continued. In the days that followed, Gabby's communication with her family became sporadic. Her mother received a few text messages, including one on August 27 that read simply, "No service in Yosemite." Later, investigators would question whether Gabby had sent that message herself. By August 30, Brian Laundrie returned alone to his parents' home in Florida, driving the van Gabby had lived in for months. Gabby was not with him. At first, Gabby's absence raised confusion rather than alarm. Long trips sometimes involved gaps in communication, but as days passed without contact, concern escalated. On September 11, 2021, Gabby Petito was officially reported missing. What followed was an explosion of public attention unlike anything seen in years. The story spread across news outlets, social media platforms, and online forums. Millions of people followed developments in real time, analyzing maps, reviewing bodycam footage, and debating timelines. The case struck a nerve because it felt intimate and immediate. Gabby looked like someone viewers knew, someone who could be a sister, friend, or daughter. Her life had been documented online, making her disappearance feel personal to strangers. As law enforcement searched for Gabby, attention shifted sharply to Brian Laundrie. He refused to speak to police. His parents declined interviews. Then on September 13, Brian himself disappeared. What had begun as a missing person case now involved two missing individuals, one van, and a rapidly narrowing window of hope. On September 19, 2021, human remains were discovered in Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. They were later confirmed to be Gabby Petito. The cause of death was determined to be homicide by manual strangulation. She was 22 years old. The revelation shattered any remaining illusion that this was a misunderstanding or accident. The story of a carefree road trip gave way to the reality of lethal domestic violence, played out across state lines and national parks. For Gabby's family, grief collided with the knowledge that her final weeks had included moments when help was close, when someone had noticed, when intervention had seemed possible. Brian Laundrie would be named a person of interest, then the focus of a nationwide manhunt. Weeks later, his remains were found in a Florida nature reserve. He had died by suicide. A notebook recovered near his body included a confession to killing Gabby Petito. The case, however, did not end there. It reverberated through discussions about domestic violence, police training, media coverage, and whose stories received national attention. Gabby's death became both a singular tragedy and a symbol, forcing the country to confront uncomfortable truths about how often warning signs are present, how easily they are rationalized, and how devastating the consequences can be when they are missed. This was not a crime hidden in darkness. It unfolded in daylight, documented in fragments, observed by strangers, and captured by cameras. And yet, it still ended the same way so many others do, with loss, regret, and the haunting realization that the moment to change the outcome had already passed. In the days after Gabby Petito's remains were found in Wyoming, the story shifted from uncertainty to reckoning. What had once been framed as a mysterious disappearance now demanded answers about how a young woman could vanish in plain sight, how violence could escalate across weeks without decisive interruption, and how systems designed to protect had failed to recognize the trajectory unfolding in front of them. As the nation mourned Gabby, attention turned to reconstructing her final days, not as isolated moments, but as a sequence of interactions, decisions, and missed opportunities that collectively formed a fatal path. Investigators began piecing together the timeline of Gabby and Brian's travels through the West with painstaking care. Witness statements, surveillance footage, phone records, campsite logs, and social media posts were analyzed to establish not only where the couple had been, but what their relationship looked like as the journey progressed. The picture that emerged was not of a sudden explosion of violence, but of sustained emotional strain, escalating control, and moments of public distress that had gone unaddressed. In mid-August, Gabby and Brian had spent time in Utah, visiting Arches National Park and surrounding areas. Multiple witnesses would later report seeing the couple argue in public spaces. In one instance, A store employee recalled seeing Brian angrily argue with Gabby, then hearing him tell her to calm down in a tone that felt dismissive and patronizing. Another witness described Gabby as visibly upset, while Brian appeared irritated, urging her to leave. These moments did not trigger police intervention at the time, but they added to a growing pattern that would only become clear in retrospect. The August 12 police stop in Moab became the focal point of national debate. Body camera footage showed officers attempting to de-escalate what they believed to be a mutual conflict. Gabby, tearful and apologetic, repeatedly took responsibility for the argument. She described feeling overwhelmed, struggling with anxiety, and trying to meet expectations she felt she was failing to achieve. Brian, calm and articulate, framed Gabby as emotionally unstable, suggesting her reactions were disproportionate and difficult to manage. The officers, constrained by their interpretation of the situation and perhaps influenced by traditional assumptions about domestic disputes, concluded that Gabby was the primary aggressor, even though the initial 911 call had reported Brian hitting her. That conclusion would later be widely criticized. Experts in domestic violence noted that Gabby's behavior, crying, self-blame, fear of abandonment, was consistent with someone experiencing emotional abuse rather than instigating it. Brian's composure, they argued, should not have been mistaken for innocence. But in the moment, the interaction ended with separation rather than arrest, with the implicit assumption that the conflict was situational and resolvable. After that night, the couple reunited and continued traveling north. Gabby's social media activity slowed. Her final Instagram post was dated August 25, showing a serene image of the van parked against a picturesque backdrop. The caption, upbeat and reflective, masked whatever reality existed behind the camera. This contrast between public image and private experience became one of the most chilling aspects of the case. Even as Gabby's world narrowed, the digital version of her life continued to present calm and beauty. On August 26 and 27, Gabby and Brian were seen in the Grand Teton area of Wyoming. Witnesses later recalled encounters that felt off, though none recognized their significance at the time. One couple reported seeing Brian acting erratically in a restaurant, arguing with staff and appearing agitated. Another witness recalled seeing Gabby alone, looking distressed, while Brian was nowhere in sight. These fragments of observation would later be stitched together to form a rough outline of Gabby's final days. The exact date of Gabby's death was determined to be between August 27 and August 30. She was found near a campsite, her body concealed in a remote area not far from where the couple had been staying. The cause of death, manual strangulation, confirmed that the act had been intentional, violent, and personal. Unlike crimes committed with weapons or from a distance, strangulation requires sustained physical force. It is a method of killing that involves proximity, control, and time. This detail alone reshaped how many people understood what had happened, replacing any lingering ambiguity with the stark reality of intimate violence. While Gabby's family struggled to absorb this loss, Brian Laundrie's actions in the days following her death raised immediate red flags. He drove the van back to Florida alone, a journey that took days, during which he made no effort to alert authorities or Gabby's family. Upon arriving home on September 1, he resumed living with his parents as if nothing had happened. He hired an attorney. He refused to answer questions. For the public, this silence felt deafening. As Gabby was reported missing and the story gained traction, the Laundrie family's behavior came under intense scrutiny. Protesters gathered outside their home. Media trucks lined the street. Questions mounted about what Brian's parents knew and when they knew it. Did they suspect something had happened? Had Brian told them? Did they help him evade police? These questions fueled public anger, though concrete answers remained elusive. On September 13, Brian Laundrie left his parents' home, allegedly to go hiking in a nearby nature reserve. Days passed before his parents reported him missing. By then, law enforcement was already under intense pressure to locate him. What followed was one of the most visible manhunts in recent U.S. history, involving local police, state authorities, federal agents, and countless volunteers. The search unfolded under the glare of constant media coverage, turning the case into a spectacle as much as an investigation. Meanwhile, Gabby Petito's story sparked a broader conversation about whose cases receive attention and why. Critics pointed out that many missing persons, particularly people of color and those from marginalized communities, rarely receive the same level of coverage. Gabby's case became a catalyst for examining disparities in media attention, prompting discussions that extended far beyond her individual tragedy. As the search for Brian continued, investigators also examined digital evidence. Phone records showed Brian using Gabby's debit card after her death. Surveillance footage placed the van in locations consistent with witness reports. A series of text messages sent from Gabby's phone raised questions about authorship and intent. Each data point added to a narrative that increasingly pointed toward Brian's responsibility. On October 20, 2021, weeks after his disappearance, human remains were found in the Carlton Reserve in Florida, an area that had been underwater during earlier searches. The remains were identified as Brian Laundrie's. Near his body, investigators found a backpack, a notebook, and a firearm. The discovery brought the manhunt to an abrupt end, but left many questions unanswered. The notebook would later reveal a written confession in which Brian admitted to killing Gabby Petito. He claimed he acted to end her suffering after an accident, a version of events that conflicted sharply with the medical findings. The confession, while closing the case in a legal sense, did little to bring clarity or comfort. Instead, it underscored the imbalance of power that had defined the relationship and the narrative Brian had tried to control until the end. For Gabby's family, the confession did not feel like closure. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no public accounting of events under oath. The opportunity to confront Brian to hear answers to their questions vanished with his death. What remained was grief, memory, and a growing determination to ensure that Gabby's life would not be defined solely by how it ended. As the nation processed the outcome, attention returned to the moments before everything went wrong. The police stop in Moab. The witnesses who noticed something felt off. The texts that sounded different from Gabby's voice. Each detail became a reminder that violence often announces itself quietly, through patterns rather than explosions. Gabby's story forced many to ask themselves what they would do differently if faced with similar signs, and whether systems built to protect are equipped to recognize danger when it does not fit familiar stereotypes. This was no longer just a story about a missing woman or a fugitive fiancé. It had become a case study in how domestic violence can hide behind smiles, how public narratives can obscure private suffering, and how intervention, when misapplied or withheld, can have irreversible consequences. And yet, even as the investigation concluded, the deeper implications of what happened were only beginning to surface. In the aftermath of Brian Laundrie's death and the discovery of his written confession, the case entered a new phase, one no longer driven by searches or speculation, but by reflection, accountability, and the uneasy task of understanding how a tragedy so visible could still feel so unresolved. For Gabby Petito's family, the world's attention offered no relief from the absence left behind. Their grief unfolded in public, shaped by interviews, court filings, and a relentless news cycle that dissected every detail of Gabby's final months. Even as official investigations concluded, the emotional and societal reckoning was just beginning. Gabby's parents, step-parents, and extended family began speaking openly about who she was beyond the headlines. They described her warmth, her creativity, her sensitivity, and her fierce love for the people she cared about. They talked about her dreams, not just of travel, but of building a life filled with meaning, expression, and connection. In doing so, they pushed back against the reduction of her identity to that of a victim, insisting that her story include the fullness of her life, not only the circumstances of her death. At the same time, they faced the painful task of examining the relationship Gabby had been in and the ways it had changed her. In hindsight, they recognized shifts they hadn't fully understood at the time. Gabby had become quieter, more anxious about disappointing others, more hesitant to assert herself. She had spoken about arguments, about stress, about feeling overwhelmed, but never framed her experiences as abuse. Like many people in similar situations, she normalized what was happening, attributing conflict to her own perceived shortcomings rather than to a partner's controlling behavior. This pattern is one of the most insidious aspects of emotional and psychological abuse. It often does not announce itself with obvious cruelty or visible injuries. Instead, it erodes confidence gradually, reframes control as concern, and teaches the victim to self-police their emotions in order to keep the peace. Gabby's repeated apologies during the Moab police stop, her willingness to accept blame, and her fear of being left alone were not signs of aggression, but of someone deeply afraid of losing stability in an already fragile situation. As experts revisited the body camera footage and police reports, broader questions emerged about law enforcement training and response protocols. The officers involved in the August 12 stop had been faced with a complex situation, but critics argued that their assessment was shaped by outdated assumptions about what domestic violence looks like. Gabby's emotional distress was interpreted as instability, while Brian's calm demeanor was read as credibility. This dynamic, experts noted, is common in cases where the abuser is composed and articulate, and the victim is visibly upset. The officer's decision to separate the couple for the night, rather than pursue a domestic violence charge or provide resources specific to abuse victims, became a focal point for reform discussions. While it was impossible to know with certainty whether a different outcome that night would have saved Gabby's life, many agreed that the response represented a missed opportunity to disrupt a dangerous trajectory. The case prompted renewed calls for trauma-informed policing and better training to recognize patterns of coercive control. Public reaction to the case also revealed uncomfortable truths about the role of media and social platforms in shaping narratives of crime. Gabby's disappearance quickly became a national obsession, amplified by her social media presence and the visual documentation of her life. Millions of strangers felt invested in her story, sharing theories, analyzing clues, and expressing outrage. While this attention helped keep pressure on authorities and may have accelerated the search, it also raised ethical questions about voyeurism, sensationalism, and the uneven distribution of empathy. At the same time, the collective response demonstrated a hunger for deeper conversations about domestic violence and prevention. Gabby's story resonated precisely because it challenged the myth that abuse only happens in certain types of relationships or to certain kinds of people. She was young, loved, supported, and pursuing her dreams, yet she still found herself in a situation that became deadly. For many viewers, this realization was deeply unsettling, forcing them to reconsider assumptions about safety and vulnerability. As weeks turned into months, legal proceedings shifted toward civil accountability. Gabby's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Brian Laundrie's estate, seeking acknowledgement of responsibility and some measure of justice, even in the absence of a criminal trial. They also pursued legal action against the Laundrie parents, alleging that they had known Gabby was dead while refusing to cooperate with authorities or her family. These actions were not only about compensation, but about truth, about forcing unanswered questions into the open. The Laundrie family, for their part, maintained that they had acted on the advice of counsel and denied knowledge of Gabby's fate prior to the discovery of her body. The tension between the two families became another layer of the tragedy, a reminder that violence ripples outward, entangling not just those directly involved but everyone connected to them. The legal battles underscored how unresolved grief often seeks expression through the justice system, especially when traditional avenues of accountability are closed. Beyond the courtroom, Gabby's name began to appear in discussions about policy and education. Advocacy organizations referenced her case when arguing for improved domestic violence screening, better support for victims, and increased public awareness of warning signs. Her family established initiatives aimed at helping others recognize unhealthy relationship dynamics and seek help before it is too late. In this way, Gabby's legacy began to shift from one of loss to one of impact, though the cost of that impact remained painfully high. The case also left a lasting imprint on how people view social media portrayals of happiness and success. Gabby's carefully curated posts, now frozen in time, became a stark illustration of how little online images can reveal about someone's internal reality. The contrast between her public persona and private distress served as a cautionary tale, reminding audiences that digital narratives are often incomplete and sometimes deliberately misleading, reflections of real life. For many who followed the story closely, the most haunting aspect was not the violence itself, but the sense of inevitability that emerged in retrospect. Each moment, viewed alone, seemed survivable, explainable, even mundane. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed unmistakably toward danger. This realization fueled a collective unease, a feeling that the tragedy was not the result of a single catastrophic decision, but of a series of small failures to intervene, to listen, to believe. As the media attention gradually faded, Gabby Petito's story remained embedded in the cultural consciousness as a symbol of both heartbreak and warning. It challenged institutions, families, and individuals to look more closely at the relationships around them, to take emotional distress seriously, and to recognize that violence does not always arrive with dramatic gestures or obvious signs. The final chapter of this story, however, was still unfolding, not in headlines or courtrooms, but in the quiet, ongoing work of remembrance and change. Gabby's life and the circumstances of her death continued to raise difficult questions about responsibility, awareness, and the cost of inaction. And it was in these questions, unresolved and deeply human, that the true weight of what happened in 2021 could be felt most clearly. As time moved forward and the immediacy of the investigation faded, what remained of the Gabby Petito case was not a neat conclusion but a lingering ache, one shaped by absence, unanswered questions, and the uncomfortable knowledge that the story could have ended differently. For her family, the passage of months and years did not soften the loss. Instead, it clarified it. Every milestone Gabby would never reach, every experience she would never have, became a quiet reminder of what had been taken, not just from her, but from everyone who loved her. In interviews and public statements, Gabby's parents spoke less about the crime itself and more about the moments before it, the subtle changes they wished they had recognized sooner, the conversations they replayed in their minds. They acknowledged how difficult it can be to see danger clearly when it is wrapped in love, hope, and the belief that things will improve. Gabby had not been isolated in the traditional sense. She spoke to her family, shared photos, described her travels. Yet there was a growing distance between what she felt and what she said, a gap that widened as the trip progressed. That gap, her family would later say, is where the danger lived. The case also forced a reckoning with how society understands responsibility in abusive relationships. For much of the public discourse, attention focused on identifying the precise moment when Brian Laundrie crossed an irrevocable line. But domestic violence experts emphasize that focusing solely on the final act risks obscuring the broader pattern that made it possible. The controlling behaviors, emotional manipulation, and gradual erosion of self-worth that preceded Gabby's death were not separate from the homicide. They were its foundation. Violence, in this sense, was not an anomaly, but the culmination of a dynamic that had been unfolding quietly for a long time. Brian Laundrie's death complicated any attempt at accountability. His suicide meant there would be no trial, no public testimony, no opportunity to challenge his version of events in a courtroom. The confession found in his notebook offered a narrative, but not truth in any meaningful sense. It was self-serving, incomplete, and contradicted by forensic evidence. For many, it felt like a final act of control, an attempt to frame the story on his terms and deny Gabby even the clarity that might come from a full accounting of what happened. The absence of legal resolution left space for anger, speculation, and grief to coexist uneasily. Some directed their frustration at Brian's parents, questioning their silence and decisions. Others focused on law enforcement, particularly the Moab police encounter, as a symbol of institutional failure. Still others turned inward, examining their own assumptions about relationships, conflict, and warning signs. In this way, the case became less about assigning blame to a single person or system, and more about confronting a web of vulnerabilities that had aligned with devastating consequences. One of the most enduring impacts of Gabby's story was the way it reshaped conversations about domestic violence among younger generations. Many people who followed the case saw reflections of their own relationships in the details that emerged. The arguments framed as misunderstandings, the apologies offered too quickly, the fear of being abandoned or seen as difficult. Gabby's experience resonated because it did not fit a stereotype. It looked ordinary, it looked familiar, and that familiarity made it frightening. Advocacy organizations reported increased engagement following the case, with more people seeking information about emotional abuse, coercive control, and early warning signs. Gabby's family worked to channel public attention into action, supporting initiatives aimed at education, prevention, and support for victims. While no effort could undo what had happened, these initiatives represented an attempt to ensure that Gabby's death would not exist in isolation, that it might contribute to saving others from similar harm. The media, too, was forced to reflect on its role. While the coverage brought visibility to Gabby's case, it also highlighted disparities in which victims receive attention and sympathy. This recognition sparked broader discussions about missing persons cases that go unnoticed, about whose stories are amplified and whose are ignored. Gabby's case became a reference point in debates about equity, representation, and the responsibilities of journalists and audiences alike. For those who had followed the story closely, there was a sense of collective mourning, a feeling that Gabby's life had intersected with theirs in a way that demanded acknowledgement. Vigils were held, murals painted, messages written by strangers who felt compelled to honor someone they had never met. This phenomenon, while sometimes criticized as performative, also reflected a genuine human response to loss made visible. Gabby's story had pierced the illusion that tragedy happens elsewhere to other people under different circumstances. Yet as the noise gradually subsided, the core truth remained unchanged. Gabby Petito was a young woman with dreams, creativity, and love to give. She deserved safety, support, and the chance to grow into the life she imagined. Her death was not inevitable, nor was it the result of a single moment of madness. It was the outcome of a relationship dynamic that escalated unchecked, of interventions that stopped short, of assumptions that obscured reality. In examining this case, it becomes clear that its power lies not in shock or spectacle, but in its familiarity. There were no hidden basements, no shadowy conspiracies, no elaborate schemes. There was a road trip, a relationship, a series of arguments, and a system that failed to recognize danger until it was too late. That ordinariness is what makes the story so difficult to confront. It suggests that prevention does not depend on extraordinary measures, but on ordinary attentiveness, empathy, and courage. The legacy of Gabby Petito is still being written, not in headlines but in quieter spaces, in conversations between friends, in moments when someone chooses to speak up, to check in, to take a warning sign seriously. Her story serves as a reminder that love should not require self-erasure, that conflict should not demand fear, and that freedom should never come at the cost of safety. In the end, this is not just a story about a crime that happened in 2021. It is a story about how easily violence can hide within dreams, how systems can falter at critical moments, and how the consequences of inaction can be irreversible. It is a story that asks, again and again, what it would take to notice sooner, to listen more carefully, and to intervene with clarity and compassion. Gabby Petito's journey ended far from home, but the impact of her life continues to travel, carried by those who remember her, learn from her story, and strive to ensure that fewer lives are lost in the same quiet, preventable way. Story 3. On a cold afternoon in late November 2021, the quiet suburban town of Oxford, Michigan, became the epicenter of one of the most disturbing school shootings in modern American history. It was not the deadliest. It was not the most chaotic. But what made it uniquely horrifying was how preventable it appeared in hindsight. This was not a case where warning signs were subtle or hidden. They were visible, documented, and discussed, yet ignored. In the aftermath, 4 students would be dead, 7 others injured, and an entire community would be forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about responsibility, accountability, and the cost of inaction. This is the story of Oxford High School, the families who trusted a system that failed them, and the chain of decisions that turned an ordinary school day into irreversible tragedy. Oxford, located about 40 miles north of Detroit, was the kind of town where people believed they were insulated from the worst aspects of American violence. With tree-lined streets, Friday night football games, and a strong sense of community pride, it was not a place residents associated with national headlines. Oxford High School served roughly 1,800 students and was considered a stable, well-run institution. Teachers knew students by name. Parents attended school events. There was a shared belief that problems could be managed quietly, internally, without escalation. That belief would prove catastrophic. Among the students at Oxford High School in the fall of 2021 were 4 teenagers whose lives would soon be cut short. Each of them had families, aspirations, and futures that extended far beyond the walls of the school. Their names would later be spoken together, but they were individuals long before they became victims. They were sons and daughters, friends and teammates, young people navigating the ordinary challenges of adolescence in a town that believed it was safe. 14-year-old Hannah St. Juliana was a freshman who had recently transferred to Oxford High School. She was described by her family as compassionate, thoughtful, and eager to make friends in a new environment. Hannah was artistic and curious, someone who paid close attention to the people around her. She was still adjusting to her new school, still learning the rhythms of her days, still imagining what her life might become. 16-year-old Tate Meyer was a junior and a standout athlete. He was deeply involved in football and wrestling, known for his strength and determination. Tate came from a family that valued discipline, teamwork, and resilience. He was competitive but kind, the type of student who pushed himself and others to be better. Teachers and coaches saw leadership potential in him, a young man who thrived on challenge. 17-year-old Madison Baldwin was a senior with a bright, expressive personality. She was involved in school activities and had a wide circle of friends. Madison was known for her warmth and her sense of humor, someone who brought energy into a room. She was weeks away from graduation, standing on the threshold of adulthood, with plans that extended far beyond high school. Also 17 was Justin Schilling, a senior with an infectious smile and a gentle demeanor. Justin had transferred to Oxford High School and quickly found his place. He was described as kind-hearted and empathetic, someone who made others feel included. Like Madison, Justin was nearing the end of his high school journey, looking ahead to the next chapter of his life. These four students shared nothing more than a school and a moment in time. They did not know that their paths would intersect in tragedy, or that their lives would be irrevocably shaped by decisions made by adults tasked with protecting them. At the center of the case was 15-year-old Ethan Crumbly, a sophomore at Oxford High School. Ethan was not a stranger to the school administration. In the weeks leading up to November 30, 2021, he had repeatedly drawn attention, not through overt violence, but through a series of increasingly alarming behaviors. These behaviors were noticed. They were discussed. They were documented. And yet, they were not acted upon in a way that could have changed the outcome. Ethan lived with his parents, James and Jennifer Crumbly, in Oxford Township. The family dynamic, as later revealed in court, was strained and distant. Ethan's parents were physically present but emotionally detached, more focused on their own lives than on their son's mental and emotional state. Teachers would later describe Ethan as withdrawn, struggling, and visibly troubled. He was not thriving socially or academically. He was a teenager in distress, signaling that distress in ways that should have prompted immediate intervention. In early November 2021, Ethan was caught searching online for ammunition during class. A teacher noticed the behavior and reported it to school administrators. Rather than treating this as a serious warning sign, the incident was addressed superficially. Ethan was spoken to. His parents were informed via email. No follow-up mental health evaluation was required. No search of his belongings was conducted. The school day continued as usual. Days later, Ethan submitted disturbing drawings as part of a class assignment. The drawings depicted a gun, a person being shot, and phrases expressing violent thoughts. One image showed a bullet with words suggesting blood and death. Another included a smiley face alongside a gun. These were not abstract doodles. They were explicit, violent, and deeply concerning. A teacher again reported the drawings to school administrators. On the morning of November 30, 2021, the situation escalated. School officials summoned Ethan and his parents to the school for an urgent meeting. The drawings were shown to them. Administrators expressed concern. They recommended that Ethan receive counseling within 48 hours, but critically, they did not insist that Ethan be removed from school that day. They did not search his backpack. They did not ask whether he had access to a firearm. They did not contact law enforcement. Despite the alarming content of the drawings, Ethan was sent back to class. What school officials did not know or did not ask was that just days earlier, Ethan's father had purchased a semi-automatic handgun as an early Christmas gift for his son. The gun had been stored in the family home. Jennifer Crumbly had even posted on social media about teaching Ethan how to use it. The gun was accessible, and on that morning it was already in Ethan's backpack. At approximately 12:51 p.m. during a passing period at Oxford High School, Ethan entered a bathroom and emerged moments later armed with a handgun. In less than 5 minutes, he fired multiple rounds down school hallways. Students and teachers ran. Some barricaded themselves in classrooms. Others hid. Chaos spread through the building as shots echoed through what had been, just moments earlier, an ordinary school day. Hannah St. Juliana was shot and killed. Tate Meyer was shot and later died in the hospital. Madison Baldwin was fatally wounded. Justin Schilling was critically injured and later succumbed to his injuries. 7 others were wounded, including a teacher. The victims were chosen at random. There was no personal motive, no targeted grievance. The violence was indiscriminate. Law enforcement responded quickly. Within minutes, officers confronted Ethan and took him into custody without further bloodshed. The gun was recovered. The threat was neutralized. But the damage had already been done. 4 families would never be the same again. As news spread, the community of Oxford descended into shock. Parents rushed to the school. Families waited for updates. Rumors and partial information circulated wildly. By the end of the day, the names of the dead began to emerge, and the full weight of what had happened settled over the town. In the hours that followed, attention turned not just to the shooter, but to the events that preceded the shooting. The warnings, the drawings, the meeting, the decision to send Ethan back to class. What initially appeared to be another tragic but unpredictable act of violence began to look something else entirely. It began to look like a failure at multiple levels. Ethan was charged as an adult with multiple counts of first-degree murder and terrorism. But the story did not end there. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered evidence that suggested this tragedy was not solely the result of one teenager's actions. It was the product of neglect, indifference, and a system that chose convenience over caution. Within days, prosecutors made a move that stunned the nation. They announced charges not only against Ethan Crumbly, but against his parents as well. James and Jennifer Crumbly were each charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, accused of enabling their son's actions through gross negligence. It was a rare and unprecedented step, one that would ignite fierce debate across the country. As Oxford mourned, the legal process began to unfold, promising to expose every decision, every missed opportunity, and every failure that led to November 30, 2021. What followed would reshape how America thinks about parental responsibility, school accountability, and the line between tragedy and crime. And this was only the beginning. In the days following the shooting, Oxford, Michigan became a town suspended between grief and scrutiny. Memorials sprang up outside the high school, candles flickering beneath photographs of smiling teenagers whose lives had ended far too soon. Parents hugged their children tighter. Classrooms sat empty as the school closed, its hallways now silent witnesses to what had unfolded. But as the community mourned, investigators were already reconstructing the hours, days, and weeks that led to the violence. And with each discovery, the narrative shifted further away from the idea of an unforeseeable tragedy and closer to something far more troubling. The focus quickly expanded beyond Ethan Crumbly himself. While his actions were indisputably central, law enforcement and prosecutors began examining the environment that had allowed those actions to occur. Digital records revealed that Ethan's behavior in the weeks leading up to the shooting was not isolated or subtle. He had searched for ammunition online during class. He had written phrases that expressed despair and violent ideation. He had drawn images that depicted bloodshed. Each of these incidents had been noticed by adults. Each had been documented, and each had been addressed in a way that minimized urgency. Investigators learned that when school officials contacted Ethan's parents after the ammunition search, the response from home was not alarmed. There was no indication that the parents took steps to secure firearms or seek immediate mental health support. Instead, the matter seemed to be brushed aside, treated as a minor disciplinary issue rather than a red flag. This pattern would repeat itself in increasingly consequential ways. The morning meeting on November 30 became a central point of scrutiny. During that meeting, school administrators sat with Ethan and his parents, reviewing the disturbing drawings. One image showed a handgun, a bullet, and words that suggested death. Another depicted a person bleeding. Notes taken during the meeting indicated that the drawings were described as concerning and that counseling was recommended. Yet the meeting ended without any decisive action. Ethan was not sent home. His backpack was not searched. His parents did not disclose that a firearm was accessible to him, and school officials did not ask. In retrospect, the meeting appeared less like an intervention and more like a procedural formality, a moment where responsibility was diffused rather than assumed. Each party seemed to believe that someone else would take the next step. The school expected the parents to handle counseling. The parents appeared to expect the school to manage the day. And Ethan, who should never have been placed in a position to make choices about safety, was returned to class. After the shooting, prosecutors moved swiftly. Ethan Crumbley was arraigned and charged as an adult, a decision that reflected the severity of the crimes and the evidence of premeditation. The charges included 4 counts of first-degree murder, terrorism causing death, and multiple counts related to the injuries of others. He was held without bond, his future now defined by the legal system rather than adolescence. But the most unprecedented development came when James and Jennifer Crumbley were also charged. Prosecutors argued that their actions, or lack thereof, directly contributed to the deaths of 4 students. They pointed to the purchase of the firearm, the failure to secure it, the disregard for warning signs, and the parents' behavior after the shooting, including attempts to flee and withdraw cash. These details painted a picture not of ignorance, but of negligence so severe that it crossed into criminal responsibility. The decision to charge the parents ignited immediate controversy. Supporters of the move argued that it was long overdue, a necessary acknowledgement that adults who enable access to weapons and ignore clear signs of distress must be held accountable. Critics warned of a slippery slope, questioning where parental responsibility should end and individual culpability should begin. The case forced the nation to grapple with uncomfortable questions about accountability in an era of recurring school violence. As the legal proceedings unfolded, more details emerged about Ethan's internal state. Jail records and court filings described a teenager who appeared detached and unemotional, yet deeply troubled. He reportedly expressed feelings of abandonment and worthlessness, emotions that had not been adequately addressed at home or at school. Mental health experts weighed in, emphasizing that while these feelings did not excuse violence, they underscored the importance of early intervention and support. The victims' families watched these developments with a mixture of pain and resolve. For them, the legal arguments were not abstract. They were personal. They had sent their children to school expecting safety, trusting that the adults in charge would act decisively if something seemed wrong. Learning how close the system had come to preventing the shooting, only to stop short, added a new layer of grief to their loss. Community meetings were held, some emotional, others contentious. Parents demanded answers from school officials. Why wasn't the backpack searched? Why weren't police called? Why was a student who had drawn violent images allowed to return to class? Administrators defended their actions, citing policies, training, and the limits of what they believed they could do. But for many, these explanations rang hollow in the face of four graves. The Oxford High School shooting also reverberated beyond Michigan. School districts across the country reviewed their threat assessment protocols. Discussions about gun safety, secure storage, and mental health resources intensified. Yet beneath these conversations was a persistent fear that the lessons would fade, that outrage would give way to routine, as it had so many times before. As winter turned to spring, the legal process moved forward. Pretrial hearings, motions, and procedural delays stretched the timeline, prolonging the uncertainty for everyone involved. The victims' families prepared themselves for years of court proceedings, knowing that justice, whatever form it took, would not be swift. Meanwhile, the community of Oxford tried to heal. The high school eventually reopened, though nothing about it felt the same. Security measures were increased. Counselors were brought in. Students returned to classrooms marked by invisible scars. Every fire drill, every loud noise, carried echoes of November 30. The case had already changed the town irrevocably, but its broader impact was still unfolding. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they framed the narrative not just as a shooting, but as a preventable collapse of responsibility. The question looming over the proceedings was not only what Ethan Crumbley had done, but who had failed to stop him when they still could. By the time the trials began to take shape, it was clear that Oxford would not simply be remembered as another entry in the long list of American school shootings. It would become a defining case, one that challenged assumptions about blame, forced institutions to examine their practices, and demanded a reckoning with the cost of ignoring warning signs. And at the center of it all were four young lives whose absence would forever shape the story. As the legal process advanced, the Oxford High School shooting transformed from a moment of communal grief into a prolonged examination of responsibility that unfolded in courtrooms rather than classrooms. The case against Ethan Crumbley moved first, and from the outset, prosecutors made clear that they would not frame the shooting as a sudden emotional breakdown or an impulsive act. Instead, they presented it as a deliberate, planned attack carried out by someone who had received warnings, had time to reconsider, and chose violence anyway. Evidence collected from Ethan's phone, school records, and witness testimony painted a picture of a teenager who had been spiraling inward for months, consumed by feelings of isolation, anger, and despair, yet outwardly signaling that distress in ways that were visible to adults who failed to intervene meaningfully. During hearings, prosecutors detailed how Ethan had accessed the firearm used in the shooting, emphasizing that it had been purchased by his father only days earlier. The gun was not secured with a trigger lock or stored in a locked safe. Instead, it was kept in a way that made it accessible to a 15-year-old who had already demonstrated alarming behavior. Messages and social media posts from Ethan's parents showed a casual attitude toward firearms, one that treated the weapon as a bonding tool rather than a lethal responsibility. This framing was crucial because it linked Ethan's actions directly to the environment in which he had been raised. Ethan ultimately pleaded guilty to all charges, including first-degree murder and terrorism. His plea spared the victims' families the ordeal of a full trial, but it did not bring closure. During sentencing, family members delivered impact statements that laid bare the depth of their loss. They spoke of empty bedrooms, unfinished plans, and the unbearable silence left behind. Some addressed Ethan directly, their words a mixture of anger, sorrow, and disbelief. Others spoke more broadly, condemning the failures that allowed the shooting to occur. The courtroom, filled with raw emotion, became a space where grief was articulated but not resolved. The sentence handed down to Ethan reflected the gravity of his crimes. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that ensured he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For some, the sentence felt appropriate. For others, it underscored the tragedy of a life that might have been redirected had intervention come sooner. Ethan was no longer a student, no longer a child in the eyes of the law, but a permanent fixture of the prison system. While Ethan's case reached its conclusion, the proceedings against his parents were only beginning, and they would prove to be among the most closely watched trials of the decade. James and Jennifer Crumbley's defense teams argued that holding parents criminally responsible for their child's actions was unprecedented and dangerous. They claimed that while mistakes may have been made, those mistakes did not rise to the level of criminal negligence. They warned that convicting the Crumbleys would set a standard that could criminalize parenting errors rather than intentional wrongdoing. Prosecutors countered by meticulously reconstructing the timeline leading up to the shooting. They emphasized not just what the parents did, but what they failed to do. They highlighted the ignored warning signs, the absence of secure gun storage, and the decision to leave Ethan at school after viewing his violent drawings. Perhaps most damaging was evidence of the parents' behavior immediately after the shooting. Surveillance footage and financial records showed that James and Jennifer attempted to withdraw large sums of money and evade authorities. Actions prosecutors argued demonstrated consciousness of guilt rather than shock or confusion. Jennifer Crumbley's trial came first, and it became a focal point for national debate. Jurors heard testimony from teachers, administrators, and law enforcement officers who described their interactions with Ethan and his parents. They reviewed messages that revealed a pattern of emotional distance and dismissiveness. The prosecution's narrative was clear. Jennifer Crumbley had ignored her son's mental health needs, failed to secure a deadly weapon, and prioritized her own interests over her child's safety and the safety of others. The defense attempted to humanize Jennifer, portraying her as an overwhelmed parent who did not fully grasp the severity of the situation. They argued that she had trusted the school to act appropriately, and that hindsight was unfairly coloring judgments about her decisions. But the weight of the evidence proved difficult to overcome. After days of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts of involuntary manslaughter. James Crumbley's trial followed a similar trajectory. Prosecutors again emphasized the purchase of the firearm, the lack of safety measures, and the failure to respond to warning signs. They argued that James, like Jennifer, had abdicated his parental responsibility in a way that directly enabled the shooting. The defense echoed earlier arguments about precedent and parental autonomy, but once again, the jury found the evidence compelling. James Crumbley was also convicted on all counts. The conviction sent shockwaves through the legal and cultural landscape. For the first time, parents were being held criminally responsible for a school shooting carried out by their child. Supporters of the verdicts hailed them as a long overdue acknowledgement that gun ownership carries profound obligations, especially when children are involved. Critics warned that the decisions could have unintended consequences, discouraging parents from seeking help for fear of legal repercussions. The debate was intense, emotional, and deeply divided. For the victims' families, the verdicts offered a measure of validation, but not peace. No sentence could restore what had been lost. No legal outcome could undo the trauma endured by survivors or erase the memories of that day. Yet there was a sense that the system, however imperfectly, had recognized the gravity of its failures. Beyond the courtroom, the Oxford case continued to influence policy discussions. School districts revisited threat assessment protocols, emphasizing the importance of taking all warning signs seriously. Some states moved to strengthen safe storage laws and clarify parental responsibilities regarding firearms. Mental health advocates renewed calls for better resources and training within schools, arguing that early intervention could prevent future tragedies. In Oxford itself, the passage of time did little to dull the pain. Anniversaries of the shooting were marked by quiet remembrance and renewed grief. The high school underwent physical changes, including renovations and security upgrades, but emotional scars remained. Students who had been present during the shooting carried the weight of that experience into adulthood, their lives forever shaped by what they had witnessed. As the legal cases concluded, attention turned to the broader question of legacy. What would the Oxford High School shooting ultimately represent? Another chapter in a long history of American gun violence, or a turning point that forced meaningful change? The answer was uncertain, but the case had undeniably altered the conversation. At its core, the Oxford tragedy was not just about a single act of violence. It was about a chain of decisions, each one seemingly small, that together created the conditions for catastrophe. It was about the cost of ignoring warning signs, the danger of complacency, and the profound consequences of failing to protect the most vulnerable. And as the community continued to reckon with its loss, the story of Oxford served as a stark reminder that prevention often hinges not on extraordinary measures, but on the courage to act decisively when something feels wrong. As the final verdicts were delivered and the courtroom lights dimmed, what remained of the Oxford High School case was not a sense of resolution, but a heavy stillness shaped by everything that could no longer be changed. For the families of the victims, the conclusion of the trials marked the end of one ordeal and the beginning of another, quieter one, where grief was no longer shared publicly each day but carried privately, into kitchens, bedrooms, and moments when the world moved on without their children. Justice, in its legal sense, had been pursued and rendered, yet it could never fully account for the depth of loss left behind. The families of Hannah St. Juliana, Tate Meyer, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling continued to speak about their children not as symbols, but as people. Hannah's parents spoke of her gentleness and curiosity, of a girl still discovering who she was meant to be. Tate's family remembered his strength and courage, recalling how even after being shot, he tried to disarm the shooter, an act that spoke to his character more clearly than any statistic ever could. Madison's loved ones described her laughter, her warmth, and her excitement about graduation and adulthood. Justin's family remembered his kindness, his ability to make others feel welcome, and the promise of a future that had been within reach. These memories became acts of resistance against the reduction of their children to headlines or case numbers. For survivors of the shooting, the passage of time brought complex challenges. Some struggled with anxiety, panic attacks, and survivor's guilt. Others found it difficult to return to ordinary routines without being triggered by sounds or situations that echoed the chaos of that day. Counseling and support services were made available, but healing proved uneven and deeply personal. The shooting had fractured not just lives, but a sense of safety that could not be easily rebuilt. Oxford High School itself became a symbol of the dual realities many American schools now inhabit, places of learning shadowed by the possibility of violence. Renovations and security enhancements were implemented, but no physical change could erase what students and teachers had experienced. For those who returned to the building, each hallway carried memory. Each classroom held echoes. Education continued, but innocence had been permanently altered. On a broader scale, the Oxford case reshaped legal and cultural conversations in the United States. The convictions of James and Jennifer Crumbley marked a turning point in how the justice system approached parental responsibility in cases of mass violence. Prosecutors across the country studied the case closely, weighing its implications. Legal scholars debated its boundaries, asking where accountability should begin and end. Gun safety advocates pointed to the verdicts as evidence that secure storage laws and responsible ownership were not abstract ideals, but life-or-death necessities. At the same time, critics voiced concerns about unintended consequences. They worried that parents might become hesitant to seek help for struggling children out of fear of legal repercussions. Mental health professionals emphasized that accountability must be paired with accessible resources, warning that punishment alone could not address the deeper issues that contribute to youth violence. These debates reflected a nation grappling with complexity rather than clinging to simple answers. The role of institutions also remained under scrutiny. While no criminal charges were filed against school officials, the Oxford shooting prompted renewed examination of threat assessment practices nationwide. Many districts revised policies to require immediate action when students display violent ideation, including mandatory evaluations and searches when warranted. Training programs were expanded, emphasizing that uncertainty should never default to inaction. The lesson, painfully learned, was that hesitation can be deadly. For the Crumbley parents, life after conviction unfolded behind prison walls. Their sentences ensured years of incarceration, a stark outcome that underscored the seriousness with which the justice system viewed their failures. Some saw their punishment as necessary accountability. Others viewed it as a tragic extension of a family already destroyed. Regardless of perspective, their case became inseparable from the broader narrative of the shooting, a reminder that violence rarely emerges in isolation. Ethan Crumbley, now serving life without parole, faded from public view, his name increasingly spoken only in legal contexts. Yet his actions continued to ripple outward, shaping policy, discourse, and memory. His case forced uncomfortable reflection on how society responds to adolescent distress, how warning signs are interpreted, and how quickly a neglected problem can escalate into irreversible harm. As years passed, anniversaries of the shooting were marked with quiet ceremonies, moments of silence, and acts of remembrance. The community of Oxford learned to carry its grief alongside daily life, a process that did not erase pain, but allowed it to coexist with resilience. Families established scholarships and foundations in their children's names, transforming loss into efforts to support others. These initiatives did not seek to find meaning in tragedy, but to prevent it from being meaningless. The Oxford High School shooting ultimately stood apart from many other cases of mass violence not because of its scale, but because of its clarity. The warning signs were visible. The opportunities to intervene were real. The failures were specific and identifiable. This clarity made the case deeply unsettling because it suggested that prevention was possible, not in theory, but in practice. It asked difficult questions about why systems designed to protect children hesitated when decisive action was needed. In the end, the story of Oxford is not just about what happened on November 30, 2021. It is about the days before and the years after, about choices made and choices avoided, about responsibility shared across individuals and institutions. It is a story that challenges the assumption that tragedy is inevitable, urging instead a reckoning with how often warning signs are minimized until it is too late. 4 young lives were taken in a matter of minutes, but their absence continues to shape conversations about safety, accountability, and care. Their names endure not as footnotes in a tragic history, but as reminders of what is at stake when society fails to act on what it knows. The Oxford case leaves behind no simple lesson, only a stark truth that vigilance, compassion, and responsibility are not optional, and that the cost of ignoring them can be measured in lives that will never be lived. Story 4. On New Year's Eve in 2021, as Mumbai glittered with celebrations and fireworks lit up the skyline, a tragedy quietly unfolded far from the cheers and festivities. In a high-rise residential building in Khar, a young psychology student attended what should have been a joyful gathering, a terrace party with friends to welcome the new year. Instead, by the early hours of January 1, the party became the scene of a brutal crime that would shock the city and reverberate for years to come. This is the story of Janvi Kukreja, her life, the fateful events of that night, and the legal journey that exposed negligence, human cruelty, and the painstaking work required to bring justice. Janvi Kukreja was 19 years old, full of potential, and just beginning to carve out her life. She was a bright student, pursuing psychology with a curiosity for human behavior and a desire to help others. Friends described her as warm, intelligent, and empathetic, a young woman navigating the threshold between adolescence and adulthood with care and enthusiasm. Her life followed the ordinary rhythms of a student in Mumbai, attending classes, spending time with friends, and making plans for her future. Yet the evening of December 31, 2020 would irrevocably alter everything. The party that night included a small group of friends, among them Shri Ambada's Jagdhankar, 26, and Dia Padalkar, 24, both familiar faces in Janvi's social circle. The rooftop terrace was filled with music, laughter, and the chaos typical of a New Year's celebration. But beneath the revelry, tensions were quietly simmering. What seemed like minor disagreements and shifting dynamics among friends would soon escalate into something far more sinister. Shortly after midnight, as celebrations carried on, Janvi was reported missing. When she was eventually found on the ground floor staircase of the building, the scene shocked everyone present. Her body bore multiple injuries, suggesting an assault rather than an accident. Emergency responders arrived to find a young woman, once full of life, lying motionless in a stairwell that had moments earlier been filled with laughter. The severity and nature of her injuries indicated that this had been a deliberate act of violence, not a misstep or fall. Police quickly secured the building and began a thorough investigation. The initial evidence suggested that Janvi had been attacked, suffering blunt force trauma and fatal injuries that left her unconscious. Forensic teams meticulously documented the scene, collecting blood samples, footprints, and other traces that could help reconstruct the sequence of events. Investigators soon turned their attention to Shri and Dia, who had been with Janvi earlier in the evening and were now central to the investigation. Early interviews and witness statements revealed that the three friends had been close prior to the party, though occasional disagreements and emotional tensions were noted. The prosecution would later argue that these tensions escalated into a violent confrontation, while the defense suggested that circumstantial evidence and interpretations of social interactions could not definitively prove intent. The absence of direct eyewitnesses meant that investigators relied heavily on forensic evidence and the behavior of the accused after the incident to reconstruct the events of that night. The evidence indicated that Janvi's assault occurred on the stairwell, with injuries consistent with multiple blows delivered over time. Police also examined the movements of the accused immediately after the incident, analyzing whether their actions reflected shock, indifference, or an attempt to evade responsibility. For the investigators, every detail, from physical traces to interpersonal dynamics, became crucial in piecing together the truth. While the investigation unfolded, public attention and media coverage intensified. Janvi's family, devastated by the sudden loss of their daughter, demanded swift and thorough justice. The community grappled with the shock of a young life violently ended in what should have been a night of celebration. Questions arose about prevention. Could the conflict have been noticed earlier? Were there warning signs overlooked? Could intervention have changed the outcome? The legal process would prove complex and prolonged. Charges were filed against both Shri and Dia, with the court proceedings scrutinizing evidence, witness statements, and forensic reports. The prosecution argued that the assault had been intentional and sustained, while the defense maintained that there was insufficient evidence to conclusively determine culpability. The emotional weight of the case, combined with the intricacies of the Mumbai legal system, ensured that resolution would be delayed. Ultimately, this case would illuminate not just the actions of the accused, but the fragile dynamics of trust, negligence, and accountability. It would become a story about the human cost of unchecked tensions, the challenge of interpreting circumstantial evidence, and the painstaking work required to bring justice in the wake of tragedy. Janvi's life, so full of promise, was cut short in a single night, leaving a void for her family and friends and a city grappling with the consequences of violence among youth. As the investigation into Janvi Kukraj's murder progressed, the Mumbai police meticulously pieced together the events leading up to the night of December 31, 2020. Detectives interviewed friends, neighbors, and party attendees, working to reconstruct the movements of Janvi, Shri Jagdhankar, and Dia Padalkar in the hours before the assault. It quickly became apparent that what had seemed like a simple social gathering had concealed underlying tensions. Several witnesses recalled subtle arguments and shifts in behavior, moments of irritation, dismissive comments, or whispered disagreements that, in hindsight, seemed ominous but were unnoticed amid the revelry. Forensic teams examined the stairwell where Janvi's body was found. Blood spatter patterns, the distribution of injuries, and drag marks suggested that she had been attacked over multiple floors, not just at a single location. The trauma indicated that the assault had been deliberate and sustained. Investigators also documented footprints and physical traces that linked the scene to Shri and Dia, analyzing how their movements corresponded to the sequence of blows. The details painted a grim picture. A young woman assaulted with intent, her injuries concentrated in a manner that could not be dismissed as accidental. Attention quickly turned to the behavior of the accused immediately following the incident. Statements, interviews, and later forensic phone analysis suggested that Shri attempted to obscure his involvement, while Dia's role remained ambiguous. Neighbors reported seeing both individuals leaving the party building in a hurry, creating an impression of avoidance. These actions would become a central point in court, where the prosecution argued that their conduct demonstrated awareness of guilt. The investigation revealed that Shri and Dia had previously been close to Janvi, socializing regularly in the weeks leading up to the party. Yet there had been subtle signs of tension, disagreements about social circles, rumors, and perceived slights that escalated without mediation. For the investigators, understanding these interpersonal dynamics was crucial in establishing motive. The prosecution later argued that a combination of jealousy, anger, and unresolved disputes set the stage for the fatal confrontation, while the defense maintained that these arguments did not amount to criminal intent. Police also examined digital evidence. Messages exchanged between the accused and their social circle provided insight into the mental and emotional state of both Shri and Dia. While nothing explicitly indicated premeditation in terms of planning a murder, the communications suggested agitation and emotional volatility. Combined with the forensic evidence and eyewitness statements, Investigators constructed a timeline of the night that allowed them to identify the sequence of actions that ultimately led to Janvi's death. The case quickly became a high-profile matter. Media coverage scrutinized every detail, from the building's security footage to social media posts made by the accused and witnesses. The city followed the investigation closely, with public discussions about youth behavior, alcohol consumption, and safety at social gatherings. Many asked whether this tragedy could have been prevented, highlighting the importance of recognizing early warning signs in friendships and social interactions. As arrests were made, Shri and Dia were taken into custody. Interrogations focused on reconstructing their actions, clarifying inconsistencies, and determining intent. Shri's statements shifted over time, and investigators noted contradictions that strengthened suspicions of direct involvement. Dia's testimony was more consistent, but questions persisted about whether she had played a passive role or had attempted to prevent the assault. The police compiled extensive reports, including physical evidence, digital traces, and witness testimonies, forming the foundation for the prosecution's case. The prosecution framed the case around the sustained nature of the assault, the deliberate actions of the accused, and the failure to seek help for Janvi once harm had begun. Experts testified on injury patterns, illustrating that her fatal wounds could not have been accidental. Medical examinations indicated the severity of trauma consistent with multiple points of impact over a short period, further supporting the claim that this was a deliberate act rather than a spontaneous accident. Meanwhile, Janvi's family grappled with shock, grief, and frustration. The prolonged investigation, coupled with the public nature of the case, intensified their emotional burden. Her mother, devastated by the loss, became vocal in demanding accountability for all involved. Family members repeatedly emphasized that their daughter's life had been stolen in circumstances that could have been prevented through awareness, intervention, and vigilance. Their advocacy brought public attention to the dangers of overlooking conflicts, even among close friends, and the importance of taking early signs of tension seriously. As the case moved toward trial, legal teams for both accused prepared rigorous arguments. The defense contended that circumstantial evidence could not conclusively prove that either Shri or Dia intended to kill Janvi, emphasizing gaps in eyewitness testimony and uncertainties about precise actions on the stairwell. They argued that emotional disputes, while regrettable, were common among young adults and did not automatically translate into criminal liability. The prosecution countered with a detailed narrative connecting motive, opportunity, and action. They argued that forensic evidence, combined with behavioral analysis, demonstrated that Shri had acted with deliberate intent, while Dia's involvement required careful scrutiny to establish whether she had participated or merely witnessed. Expert testimony highlighted the significance of each wound, the sequence of events, and the physical evidence linking the accused to the fatal assault. In the months leading up to the trial, both accused remained in custody. The city continued to follow the developments closely, with public debates about youth behavior, responsibility, and the role of peer dynamics in escalating conflicts. Psychologists and legal experts weighed in on the broader implications, discussing how small tensions among young adults can, in extreme circumstances, escalate into irreversible tragedies. The stage was set for a trial that would last several years, reflecting both the complexity of the evidence and the gravity of the crime. It would examine not only what happened that night, but why it happened, holding individuals accountable for choices that led to a young life ending prematurely. The trial would ultimately highlight the intersection of human behavior, accountability, and the law, revealing the painstaking process required to deliver justice in a case where every detail mattered. When the trial for Janvi Cuckridge's murder finally commenced, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. For the families of the victims, the proceedings were a formal acknowledgement of the years of grief and uncertainty they had endured. For the accused, the trial was a high-stakes test of legal strategy and interpretation. From the outset, the prosecution laid out a detailed reconstruction of the events on the night of December 31, 2020, portraying a sequence in which a social gathering between friends devolved into a fatal confrontation. Using forensic reports, photographs of the crime scene, and expert analysis of injury patterns, they aimed to prove that the assault was deliberate and that Sri Ambada's Jagdhankar had inflicted fatal blows on Janvi in a sustained attack that left her lifeless on the stairwell. Medical experts testified about the nature and severity of Janvi's injuries. They described in precise detail the blunt force trauma to her head, the multiple contusions across her body, and the fatal impact that ended her life. The prosecution argued that such injuries could not have resulted from a simple fall or accidental misstep, emphasizing the pattern of sustained violence that indicated deliberate intent. Forensic analysts walked the jury through drag marks and blood spatter evidence, reconstructing the movement of both Janvi and her assailant across several floors, showing how her fatal injuries were inflicted in a manner consistent with a targeted assault rather than a momentary altercation. Witnesses were called to testify about the social dynamics between Janvi, Sri, and Dia. Friends recounted subtle arguments that had occurred earlier in the evening, moments of tension that seemed insignificant at the time, but which the prosecution framed as precursors to the fatal encounter. Testimonies highlighted instances of irritation, dismissive comments, and emotional volatility that, in combination with other evidence, suggested a motive rooted in jealousy and unresolved conflict. These narratives painted a portrait of social friction that escalated into violence, reinforcing the prosecution's case that the events were not accidental but the result of deliberate human action. The defense, meanwhile, worked to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. Lawyers for Sri emphasized the absence of direct eyewitness accounts of the assault, arguing that circumstantial evidence alone could not definitively prove intent. They questioned the interpretation of forensic findings and pointed out that emotional disagreements among friends are common and not inherently criminal. The defense for Dia focused on her peripheral involvement, arguing that while she had been present at the party, there was insufficient evidence to prove that she actively participated in the assault. Both defense teams contended that reasonable doubt existed regarding the sequence of events and the degree of culpability for each accused. Digital evidence became a significant aspect of the trial. Investigators had analyzed phone records and social media interactions, which offered insights into the behavior and mental state of the accused. While there was no explicit planning of murder in the messages, patterns of agitation, miscommunication, and emotional intensity were highlighted by the prosecution as reflective of a volatile situation that culminated in fatal violence. Analysts testified on the timing and content of messages, cross-referencing them with witness accounts and forensic evidence to build a cohesive timeline of the night's events. The courtroom proceedings extended over months, with each piece of evidence meticulously examined. The jury heard from forensic experts, neighbors, friends, and investigators, each providing testimony that pieced together the tragic events of the night. The defense continued to challenge the credibility of witnesses and the interpretations of forensic evidence, attempting to persuade the jury that the assault had been unintentional or that Dia had no active role in the crime. Emotional testimonies from Janvi's family underscored the human cost, emphasizing the bright future that had been lost and the irreparable impact on those left behind. As the trial progressed, psychological experts were called to provide context on the social dynamics at play. They discussed adolescent and young adult behavior, emotional regulation, and the potential for disputes to escalate when combined with alcohol, peer pressure, and social tension. These experts framed the case within a broader understanding of human behavior, helping the jury appreciate not just the physical evidence, but the emotional and psychological context of the incident. Throughout the proceedings, the public and media followed every development closely. Mumbai's citizens debated issues of accountability, responsibility, and prevention, reflecting on how minor interpersonal conflicts can, in extreme cases, escalate into irreversible tragedy. Schools, colleges, and youth organizations examined the case as a cautionary tale, emphasizing awareness, communication, and the importance of early intervention in social conflicts. Ultimately, the trial centered on two critical questions. First, whether Shri had intentionally inflicted fatal injuries on Janvi, and second, whether Dia had played an active role in the assault or was merely present. The prosecution argued that the combination of forensic evidence, behavioral analysis, and post-incident actions established Shri's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The defense emphasized the absence of direct observation, the possibility of accidental escalation, and the ambiguity of Dia's role. As the case neared its conclusion, the courtroom remained a space of intense emotion. Janvi's family continued to bear the weight of their loss, while the accused faced the possibility of life-altering sentences. The detailed examination of forensic reports, witness statements, and behavioral evidence had made one thing clear: the events of that night were neither random nor fleeting. They were the result of human decisions and actions that had fatal consequences. The stage was set for the jury to deliberate, weighing every shred of evidence, every testimony, and every interpretation. The case had become a landmark example of how circumstantial evidence, when carefully collected and analyzed, could reconstruct a crime in the absence of eyewitness testimony. It highlighted the painstaking process required to deliver justice and the intricate balance between legal interpretation, human behavior, and accountability. After months of testimony, cross-examination, and meticulous review of evidence, the trial in Janvi Kukreja's murder case reached its climax. The courtroom was thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver a verdict that would conclude a legal process spanning several years. For Janvi's family, the moment represented not just a legal resolution but a moral reckoning, a formal acknowledgement of the life taken from them and the responsibility of those involved. For the accused, Shri Ambada's Jagdhankar and Dia Padalkar, it was the culmination of intense scrutiny, public attention, and the possibility of life-altering consequences. The jury considered months of forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, digital communications, and behavioral analyses. The prosecution had built a narrative that combined the severity of Janvi's injuries, the forensic reconstruction of her movements across the stairwell, and the observed behavior of the accused before and after the crime. Shri's actions, the prosecution argued, reflected deliberate intent to harm, culminating in a fatal assault that could not be explained by accident. The case highlighted how emotional volatility and unresolved conflict, when coupled with opportunity and physical aggression, can lead to irreversible tragedy. After careful deliberation, the court found Shri Ambada's Jagdhankar guilty of murder. The verdict underscored the weight of the forensic evidence and the consistency of witness testimonies that linked him directly to the assault. In delivering the sentence, the judge emphasized the deliberate nature of the crime, the sustained violence inflicted, and the societal need for accountability. Shri was sentenced to life imprisonment, reflecting the severity of his actions and the irreversible consequences they had caused. The sentence was intended not only as punishment, but also as a deterrent, reinforcing the principle that deliberate acts of violence carry profound legal and moral consequences. In contrast, the court acquitted Dia Padelkar. The prosecution had failed to establish beyond reasonable doubt that she had actively participated in the assault. While her presence at the party and proximity to the events were undeniable, the legal threshold for criminal liability was not met. The acquittal highlighted the challenges courts face in distinguishing between active participation and passive presence, emphasizing the importance of precise evidence and careful interpretation in the administration of justice. The verdict brought a measure of relief to Janvi's family, though it could not undo the loss they had suffered. Her mother expressed a mixture of grief and determination, vowing to continue advocating for accountability and raising awareness about the dangers of overlooked interpersonal conflict. For the community, the case served as a stark reminder of how quickly ordinary social interactions can escalate into tragedy when emotional tensions, miscommunication, and unchecked aggression converge. In the months following the verdict, discussions about youth behavior, responsibility, and the importance of early intervention intensified. Schools and colleges examined the case as a cautionary example, emphasizing conflict resolution, communication, and awareness of peer dynamics. Psychologists and legal experts highlighted the broader societal lessons, discussing how minor disputes can spiral into devastating outcomes when combined with aggression and opportunity. Shri Ambadas Jagdhankar began serving his life sentence, entering the correctional system with the weight of his actions firmly established by the court. The legal system, while imperfect, had demonstrated its capacity to hold individuals accountable even in cases lacking direct eyewitness testimony. The painstaking reconstruction of events, careful analysis of forensic evidence, and comprehensive courtroom proceedings exemplified the diligence required to administer justice in complex cases. For Dia Padelkar, the acquittal marked the end of legal scrutiny, but did not erase the emotional toll of the case. Public opinion remained divided, and the social consequences of her association with the events lingered. The distinction between legal accountability and moral responsibility became a topic of debate, illustrating the nuanced nature of justice when evidence is circumstantial and human behavior ambiguous. The tragedy of Janvi Kukraja's murder left an indelible mark on her family, friends, and community. It exposed vulnerabilities in social dynamics, the potential for escalation in seemingly ordinary situations, and the critical importance of vigilance and intervention. Her life, full of promise and potential, was cut short, leaving a void that could never be filled. Yet, through the judicial process and public discourse, her story became a catalyst for reflection, education, and awareness. In the years following the verdict, Janvi's family continued to honor her memory. They engaged in community initiatives focused on youth mentorship, conflict resolution, and raising awareness about the consequences of violence. Her story became a lesson in both caution and hope, a reminder that while human behavior can lead to tragedy, careful reflection, accountability, and community support can help prevent future losses. The case also reinforced the importance of the legal system's role in balancing evidence, intent, and circumstance. It demonstrated how forensic science, careful witness examination, and diligent investigation can reconstruct events in the absence of direct observation, ensuring that justice is served even in complex and emotionally charged situations. For the city of Mumbai, the murder of Janvi Kukraja remains a cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the profound consequences that can result when conflict escalates unchecked. Ultimately, this tragedy stands as a testament to the value of life, the need for accountability, and the enduring efforts of families and communities to seek justice. Janvi's story, though marked by loss, continues to inspire reflection and action, emphasizing that while crime can devastate lives, the pursuit of justice and the lessons learned from such events have the power to shape a more vigilant, compassionate society. Story 5. On the afternoon of October 14, 2021, the tranquil island of Dangethi in the Alafu atoll of the Maldives was shaken by news that would haunt its residents for years to come. What had begun as ordinary daily rhythm, fishermen returning from sea, children playing in the narrow lanes, elders sipping tea in shade, suddenly transformed into a crime scene when the body of a respected local businessman was discovered in a water well at an abandoned house. The victim, 57-year-old Mahmoud Abubakar, was well known throughout the island for his entrepreneurial spirit. He supplied essential food staples, owned a busy cafe, operated a boat service, and was regarded as a pillar of the community, a man whose reputation was rooted in hard work, respectability, and the trust he had earned over decades living on the island. His disappearance, first noticed when he failed to return home after going about his usual errands, quickly escalated from concern to shock to collective grief as the truth emerged. The body found in the well bore multiple wounds and signs of a brutal assault, and the peaceful rhythm of Dangethi life was abruptly replaced by grief, suspense, and ultimately a police investigation that stretched far beyond what anyone had imagined. When the initial call came in reporting a missing person, there was no immediate sense of urgency. It was not uncommon for an adult from the community to be delayed or to lose track of time while tending to business matters on the island. But as hours passed and Mahmoud did not return, family members grew anxious. When someone eventually ventured to check a long-abandoned house near the edges of the island settlement, a derelict structure locals avoided at night, the discovery of Mahmoud's body in the well sent a shockwave through the community. His arms and legs were bound. Signs of foul play were obvious even to non-experts, and the brutality suggested not an accident, but a deliberate and savage attack that demanded explanation. The crime was unlike anything many residents had witnessed in their lifetime, and the horror of seeing a trusted figure so violently ended was palpable. With the body recovered by police and taken for forensic examination, questions multiplied. Who could have done this? Why? And how could such a crime have taken place in a place that prided itself on tight-knit relationships and relative peace? The Maldives Police Service responded swiftly, dispatching a homicide investigation team and forensic specialists to Dangethi. The island's close community was now at the center of a criminal investigation involving questions of motive, opportunity, and responsibility. Early in the inquiry, detectives found clues that pointed away from coincidence and toward premeditation. CCTV footage from the quiet island captured a foreign man carrying a heavy load late at night, moments later seen crossing near the locations connected to Mahmoud's movements. Residents recalled hearing screams from a house on the night Mahmoud went missing, though at the time no one knew their meaning. These auditory fragments, vague when first noticed, now took on ominous significance. As forensic teams worked methodically through blood patterns, footprints, and traces of personal items buried in nearby yards, a narrative gradually began to form, one that was dark, complicated, and ultimately tied to someone who had until then been only a peripheral figure in the community. Within 2 days of the body being found, police arrested a migrant worker from Bangladesh. a 29-year-old man named Shah Alam Mia, commonly called Salim, who had been living and working on the island as a live-in caretaker for an elderly resident. His proximity to the victim's last known movements, and the fact that personal effects belonging to Mahmoud, his phone, identity card, and other items, were discovered buried near Salim's residence propelled him into the center of the case. The police, following procedures for homicide investigations on small islands, remanded him into custody as suspicion mounted and evidence accumulated. Residents, shocked by both the discovery of Mahmoud's body and the implication of someone who had lived quietly among them, grappled with disbelief and grief. The man they had known, who contributed to island commerce and social life, had been violently killed, and now someone they had seen daily was the focus of the investigation. Police emphasized that at that point no other suspects were linked to the crime, and that the evidence connecting Salim to the murder was significant. Investigators explained that the absence of involvement by others suggested the act was carried out by a single individual, despite the earlier arrests and questioning of other men who had been wrongly suspected by anxious residents. This narrowing of focus did not immediately quell fear or speculation, but it did lend shape to what had been for many a chaotic and frightening set of circumstances. The community watched as the formal processes of law enforcement brought clarity to a situation that only days earlier had been defined by confusion and mourning. During the initial stages of interrogation, the suspect confessed to the murder, acknowledging in police interviews that he had killed Mahmoud. In his statements, he admitted inflicting multiple wounds on the victim's body, over 30 in total, and described aspects of the attack and disposal of the corpse that revealed a disturbing level of violence. The confession, coming at the investigative stage, provided a critical turning point in the case and gave the police the foundation they needed to formalize the prosecution. At the same time, it sent ripples through the island. Neighbors and colleagues of both the victim and accused struggled to reconcile the act with the familiar routines that had defined their daily lives. A man's life had been taken, not in an accident or spontaneous quarrel, but through calculated brutality, and the implications weighed heavily on everyone connected to the case. As investigators continued to gather evidence, the motivations behind the crime began to take shape. Police suggested that greed was a significant factor. Mahmoud was known to carry cash and had been seen with substantial sums at times due to his business dealings, and the suspect had lured him under the pretense of a meeting. When conflict over money arose, it escalated into violence. This interpretation was supported by available evidence and interviews with those who had indirect knowledge of Mahmoud's financial activities. It painted a picture of a crime that was not random, but rooted in a dispute over material gain that aroused lethal intent. For many in the community, the idea that someone would end a fellow resident's life for money was incomprehensible, turning fear and grief into anger and a deep sense of betrayal. The investigation did not stop with the initial confession. Detectives combed through CCTV footage from the island, corroborating elements of the suspect's statements and piecing together the timeline of Mahmoud's final hours. Surveillance captured Salim carrying a heavy load in the early hours of the morning after Mahmoud was reported missing, a detail that reinforced his involvement. Police searched Salim's quarters, uncovering items belonging to Mahmoud and signs that the suspect had attempted to conceal elements of the crime. The collection of such physical and digital evidence supported a prosecution strategy that would rely on both the defendant's own admissions and circumstantial proof linking him to the violent act. For Mahmoud's family, the discovery and subsequent investigation were moments of devastating clarity. The grief of losing a loved one was compounded by the horror of how he died and the public nature of the case. He left behind a wife and 4 children, a family suddenly bereft of a husband and father, navigating torment from loss and uncertainty about the motives that had led to such a brutal end. Immediate reactions ranged from deep sorrow to anger, and as the legal process unfolded, family members expressed a desire for accountability not merely as formal justice, but as a form of closure to a chapter of life that had ended so violently. What had begun as ordinary life on a peaceful island had become a case of murder, confession, and a community irrevocably altered by the act of a neighbor and acquaintance. The police arrest and confession marked the start of a judicial process that would extend for years, involving the careful preparation of charges, the filing of indictments, and deliberation by courts required to consider evidence and testimony in detail. Charges against the suspect included murder and abuse of a corpse, allegations that reflected both the act of killing and the manner in which the victim's body was treated after death. Under the Maldives Penal Code, intentional murder carried the severest penalties available, including, in certain circumstances, a sentence that could approach the ultimate punishment under law. For the people of Dangethi, watching these legal mechanisms take shape was a sobering reminder that fatal violence, once unleashed, could not be undone, even as the system sought to respond with severity and order. In the immediate months following the arrest, security and daily life on Dangethi remained strained by the memory of the murder. Residents spoke quietly about the crime, reviewed what they knew, and remembered Mahmoud as a figure whose life had intersected with nearly everyone on the island in some way. Some reflected on missed opportunities to notice warning signs. Others struggled with the idea that a longtime neighbor could commit such a crime. Conversations among families often circled around safety, trust, and the fragile balance that holds small communities together. A balance that, in an instant, had been disrupted. Emerging from shock and grief, the community sought to reclaim normalcy, even as the shadow of the murder lingered in shared memory and collective concern. Through painstaking evidence gathering, interviews, and judicial preparation, a comprehensive picture of the crime had been assembled, laying the groundwork for prosecution in the Maldives criminal courts. The case would test not only legal standards and evidentiary thresholds, but also the community's resilience in confronting the darkest aspects of human behavior hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. As the legal process moved forward, the island of Dangethi braced for the chapters to come, knowing that the story of Mahmoud's murder was not simply a local tragedy, but a reflection of how quickly familiar faces can be implicated in violence, and how justice must navigate that complexity in the years that follow. Following the arrest of Shah Alam Mia, investigators in the Maldives intensified their scrutiny of the events surrounding Mahmoud Abubakar's death. Forensic teams returned to the abandoned house where his body had been discovered, documenting blood patterns, the placement of personal belongings, and footprints that corroborated the suspect's movements. Each detail, from the binding of the victim to the manner in which he had been concealed in the well, suggested a level of deliberation that the police described as chilling. The evidence indicated that Mahmoud had struggled against his assailant, yet the suspect's control over the scene had been methodical, emphasizing the deliberate nature of the attack. Detectives noted that the use of bindings and the selection of an abandoned location for disposal were indicative of premeditation and a clear intent to prevent discovery. Police interviews with neighbors and witnesses revealed additional context. Several individuals recalled hearing raised voices and suspicious activity in the hours before Mahmoud's disappearance. A fisherman reported seeing the suspect near the area where Mahmoud conducted some of his business late at night, and others observed the suspect carrying large bags in the early morning. While these observations initially seemed mundane, combined with forensic findings, they formed a consistent narrative, aligning with the suspect's own confession. Authorities cross-checked the timeline meticulously, confirming movements, interactions, and deviations from routine that had, in hindsight, pointed to the impending crime. Digital evidence played a significant role in the investigation. Police recovered Shah Alam Mia's mobile phone and analyzed call logs, messaging apps, and location data. The records indicated a series of communications in the days leading up to the murder that suggested premeditation related to financial grievances. Investigators noted that the suspect had made arrangements to access areas of the island where Mahmoud frequently traveled alone, and messages between him and acquaintances revealed an increasing agitation over disputes involving cash and property. These communications, while not explicitly stating an intent to kill, demonstrated a mindset of escalating hostility and provided a digital footprint that reinforced the theory of deliberate action. In his interrogation, Shah Alam Mia described the murder in detail. He admitted to luring Mahmoud to the abandoned house under the pretext of discussing business matters, a tactic he later acknowledged was designed to isolate the victim. Once Mahmoud arrived, the suspect claimed that an argument over money escalated, resulting in physical violence. The confession included admissions of multiple blows to the victim's head and torso, the binding of arms and legs, and the placement of Mahmoud's body in the well. The explicit recounting of the sequence of events allowed investigators to confirm aspects of the forensic evidence, aligning injuries, drag patterns, and blood distribution with the suspect's narrative. The confession, taken seriously by the authorities, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, offering a comprehensive account of a crime that had otherwise shocked the close-knit island community. Community reaction was immediate and visceral. Residents of Danjethi, who had long regarded both Mahmoud and the accused as familiar faces, struggled to reconcile the events with the familiar routines of daily life. Mahmoud had been a trusted businessman, and Salim had been an employee and neighbor. The betrayal inherent in the act compounded grief with disbelief. Families spoke cautiously about the incident, emphasizing the importance of safety and awareness even in small, tight-knit communities. Local leaders and elders called for calm, urging residents to allow the judicial process to unfold while reflecting on the broader lessons about vigilance, trust, and the consequences of conflict left unresolved. Meanwhile, police pursued further investigative avenues. Forensic experts conducted extensive examinations of the suspect's living quarters, uncovering items belonging to Mahmoud, including personal documents, clothing, and other materials. These discoveries supported the claim that the suspect had not acted impulsively, but had sought to conceal evidence in the aftermath of the murder. Investigators reconstructed the timeline minute by minute, considering witness statements, surveillance observations, and digital traces. Each piece of evidence reinforced the narrative of premeditated violence, providing prosecutors with a strong foundation for presenting the case in court. As the legal process approached, authorities prepared formal charges. Shah Alam Mia was charged with murder and abuse of a corpse, both serious offenses under the Maldives Penal Code. The murder charge reflected the deliberate and intentional act that resulted in Mahmoud's death, while the abuse of a corpse charge addressed the handling of the victim's body and the concealment in the well. Prosecutors emphasized the severity of the crime, highlighting the deliberate nature of the assault and the breach of community trust. Legal teams began organizing evidence, witness testimonies, forensic reports, and digital records to present a comprehensive account to the courts. For Mahmoud's family, the confirmation of the suspect's confession brought a complex mix of relief and continued grief. While the admission of guilt offered clarity and validation of their concerns, it did not erase the trauma of the loss. Family members described their ongoing struggles with grief, emphasizing the suddenness and brutality of the act. They began engaging with community leaders, raising awareness about crime prevention and safety, and advocating for timely and thorough legal proceedings. The murder, once a shocking disruption, became a catalyst for conversations about accountability, vigilance, and the broader social responsibility of the community. The case also drew attention to larger systemic issues. Questions arose about how disputes over money and interpersonal grievances could escalate to lethal violence, even in close-knit communities. Authorities reviewed procedures for monitoring migrant workers and residents' interactions, emphasizing preventive strategies for conflict resolution and early intervention. The tragic outcome of Mahmoud's murder highlighted the importance of identifying signs of escalating disputes, the need for accessible reporting mechanisms, and the value of community awareness in preventing similar incidents. Months of meticulous preparation culminated in the filing of formal indictments. Prosecutors compiled a detailed case file, integrating the suspect's confession, forensic analysis, digital evidence, and eyewitness accounts. Each element was carefully documented to ensure a cohesive narrative demonstrating deliberate intent and personal responsibility. The stage was set for a judicial process that would rigorously examine every detail of the crime, weighing the physical, digital, and testimonial evidence to deliver justice for Mahmoud Abubakar, whose life had been violently ended in a community that had once regarded him as a pillar of trust and commerce. When the trial of Shah Alam Mia commenced, the courtroom in Malé was tense with a mix of anticipation, grief, and the heavy weight of public attention. For the family of Mahmoud Abubakar, the proceedings represented both a legal reckoning and a long-awaited acknowledgement of the brutal act that had shattered their lives. Community members, journalists, and legal observers gathered to witness a case that had captured national attention, reflecting not only the shocking violence of the crime, but also broader concerns about safety, justice, and the treatment of migrant workers in the Maldives. The courtroom was filled with the quiet hum of anticipation as lawyers, judges, and jurors prepared to examine a case defined by deliberate cruelty, meticulous investigation, and a confession that laid bare the dark realities of human behavior. From the outset, the prosecution presented a detailed reconstruction of the crime. Using forensic reports, photographs of the scene, and expert testimony, they demonstrated how Mahmoud had been lured to the abandoned house and fatally assaulted. Medical experts described in precise detail the injuries inflicted on the victim, noting the multiple contusions, blunt force trauma to the head and torso, and the fatal wounds consistent with repeated strikes. Each piece of forensic evidence underscored the deliberate nature of the act, reinforcing the prosecution's argument that Mahmoud's death was not accidental or spontaneous, but the result of calculated violence. They emphasized the alignment between the suspect's own statements and the physical evidence, showing how confessions, digital traces, and forensic findings coalesced into a coherent narrative of premeditated murder. Witnesses were called to provide context about the events leading up to the crime. Neighbors, colleagues, and friends of Mahmoud described interactions with both the victim and the accused, highlighting a history of minor disputes, financial disagreements, and moments of tension that, while seemingly ordinary, were framed by the prosecution as precursors to the fatal confrontation. Eyewitness testimony, though limited due to the crime occurring largely in isolation, offered corroboration of movements and behaviors observed in the hours before the murder. Individuals recalled seeing the suspect in proximity to Mahmoud's routines, carrying items later determined to be used in the commission of the crime. These accounts painted a portrait of calculated opportunity, a series of decisions that culminated in a tragic and preventable loss. Digital evidence played a central role in the proceedings. Call logs, messaging applications, and location data recovered from the suspect's phone were presented to the court, illustrating communications and actions that occurred before and after the murder. Investigators demonstrated how these digital footprints mapped onto the physical evidence, confirming timelines, movements, and the suspect's awareness of the severity of his actions. Analysts explained that while the communications did not explicitly mention intent to kill, they reflected agitation, planning, and awareness of potential consequences. This evidence, combined with the suspect's own admissions, created a compelling narrative for the jury, connecting motive, opportunity, and execution of the crime. The defense sought to challenge the prosecution's narrative, focusing on questions of interpretation and context. Lawyers argued that while the suspect admitted to the assault, aspects of the case could be viewed as accidental or the result of an escalation rather than premeditation. They highlighted ambiguities in witness statements, questioned the reliability of certain forensic interpretations, and emphasized the lack of eyewitnesses directly observing the act. The defense also explored the psychological state of the accused, raising considerations of stress, financial pressure, and situational provocation. These arguments were intended to introduce reasonable doubt regarding the degree of intent and the circumstances surrounding Mahmoud's death, though they faced the challenge of reconciling the suspect's detailed confession with claims of diminished culpability. Throughout the trial, forensic experts provided testimony regarding both the physical injuries sustained by Mahmoud and the handling of the body. They described in technical terms how the victim's arms and legs had been bound, the location of blood spatters, and the methodical placement in the abandoned well. This evidence reinforced the argument that the crime had been intentional and meticulously carried out, countering the defense's claims of spontaneous escalation. The court examined the sequence of actions in detail, using diagrams and photographic evidence to clarify the chronology and align witness observations with the forensic record. Emotional testimony from Mahmoud's family underscored the human cost of the crime. His wife, children, and extended family described the loss of a husband, father, and provider whose absence had left profound voids in their lives. They recounted his daily routines, his contributions to the community, and the lasting impact of his death. These testimonies, while deeply personal, reinforced the societal and moral weight of the case, illustrating the broader consequences of violent crime beyond the immediate act. The prosecution used these accounts to contextualize the severity of the offense, emphasizing the necessity of accountability and the role of the courts in delivering justice. The trial extended over several weeks, with each piece of evidence examined in painstaking detail. The prosecution presented a timeline of Mahmoud's final hours, the suspect's movements, and the discovery of the body. They illustrated how forensic, digital, and testimonial evidence converged to depict a coherent and compelling narrative of deliberate action. The defense continued to challenge specific interpretations, but the alignment of multiple forms of evidence, confession, physical injuries, digital communication, and witness observation, strengthened the case against Shah Alam Mia. Psychological experts were also called to provide insight into the behavior of the accused and the dynamics that led to the murder. They discussed factors such as emotional regulation, response to perceived financial disputes, and decision-making under stress. While acknowledging situational pressures, the experts emphasized that the deliberate actions, binding the victim, disposing of the body, and attempting to conceal evidence, indicated awareness and intentionality rather than a momentary lapse or accident. These analyses provided the jury with a deeper understanding of the intersection between human behavior and criminal intent, framing the actions within both social and psychological contexts. As the trial progressed toward its conclusion, attention shifted to deliberation. The evidence, meticulously presented over weeks, offered jurors a comprehensive view of the crime, balancing the suspect's confession, forensic data, and testimonial accounts against the defense's arguments of context and psychological pressure. The case highlighted not only the severity of the act, but also the process by which courts reconstruct events, evaluate intent, and assign legal responsibility. In the small community of Dangethi, anticipation for the verdict was palpable. Residents reflected on the fragile nature of safety, the consequences of unresolved disputes, and the capacity of the judicial system to respond effectively to violent crime. After weeks of testimony, forensic analysis, and careful examination of digital evidence, the trial of Shah Alam Mia moved to its final phase. The courtroom in Malé was heavy with anticipation as the jury prepared to deliberate. For Mahmoud Abubakar's family, the trial had been a journey through grief, shock, and anger, and now it was a moment when justice, in the form of a formal verdict, would finally be rendered. The proceedings reflected not only the severity of the crime, but also the meticulous work of investigators and prosecutors, who had pieced together the events of that fateful October day on Dangethi. The jury considered the suspect's confession, which detailed the assault, binding, and disposal of Mahmoud's body, alongside forensic reports confirming the wounds and placement of the victim in the abandoned well. Testimony from neighbors and witnesses corroborated elements of the confession, and digital evidence mapped the suspect's movements before and after the murder. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate nature of the act, the premeditated attempts to conceal the crime, and the breach of trust within a close-knit community. The evidence presented portrayed a man who had carried out a calculated act of violence, undermining claims that the killing had been accidental or the result of sudden escalation. Defense attorneys highlighted the psychological pressures and situational stress experienced by the accused, arguing that financial disputes, isolation, and emotional strain contributed to the actions taken. They attempted to frame the crime as a tragic outcome of escalating conflict rather than purely premeditated murder. However, the jury weighed these mitigating factors against the overwhelming evidence of planning, deliberation, and the suspect's own detailed confession. The prosecution's meticulous presentation of timelines, forensic analysis, and witness accounts left little room for doubt regarding Shah Alam Mia's culpability. After careful deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty for murder and abuse of a corpse. The judgment underscored the severity of the crime and the deliberate nature of the suspect's actions. In delivering the sentence, the presiding judge emphasized the calculated violence, the attempts to conceal the crime, and the profound impact on the victim's family and the broader community. Shah Alam Mia was sentenced to life imprisonment, reflecting both the gravity of the offense and the legal standards governing murder in the Maldives. The sentence also included additional terms for the abuse of the corpse, ensuring that the total punishment addressed all aspects of the criminal conduct. The verdict brought a measure of closure to Mahmoud's family, though the grief of their loss could never be fully erased. They expressed relief that the judicial system had recognized the deliberate nature of the crime and had held the perpetrator accountable. Public statements emphasized the importance of community vigilance, the value of timely reporting of suspicious activity, and the role of legal processes in providing redress for victims of violent crime. The family also began initiatives to honor Mahmoud's memory, advocating for safety awareness and supporting programs designed to prevent similar tragedies on small islands. For the community of Dangethi, the trial and verdict prompted reflection on trust, safety, and the fragility of daily life in close-knit environments. Residents acknowledged the shock of seeing a familiar face responsible for such violence and recognized the importance of early intervention in conflicts and monitoring of interpersonal disputes. Schools, community leaders, and local authorities emphasized conflict resolution, awareness, and vigilance as lessons drawn from the tragedy. The murder had exposed vulnerabilities in social dynamics, the risks posed by unresolved disputes, and the devastating consequences of violent escalation. In the months following the verdict, discussions about safety and justice continued across the Maldives. Authorities reviewed procedures for monitoring and managing migrant worker interactions, highlighting preventive measures that could reduce the risk of similar crimes. Law enforcement agencies emphasized the importance of prompt reporting, forensic preparedness, and careful investigation in solving complex cases. The Mahmoud Abubakar case became a reference point for law enforcement and communities alike, illustrating how deliberate violence, even in small, seemingly secure communities, could have catastrophic consequences. The case also highlighted the resilience of Mahmoud's family and the role of community support in navigating the aftermath of violent crime. Family members remained engaged in advocacy and public awareness efforts, focusing on conflict prevention, safety education, and fostering vigilance within their island and beyond. Their commitment underscored a broader lesson about the importance of transforming grief into constructive action, ensuring that the tragedy led to meaningful reflection and community strengthening. Shah Alam Mia began serving his life sentence, entering the Maldivian correctional system with the full weight of his crime recognized by the courts. The judicial outcome reinforced the principle that deliberate acts of violence, especially those involving premeditation and attempts at concealment, would be met with the severest legal consequences available. The case demonstrated the capacity of the Maldivian legal system to navigate complex investigations, integrate forensic and digital evidence, and deliver justice, even in remote and close-knit island communities. Ultimately, the murder of Mahmoud Abubakar stands as a sobering reminder of the fragility of life, the destructive potential of conflict, and the critical importance of community vigilance. It underscores how ordinary social interactions can escalate into tragedy when anger, opportunity, and calculated action converge. While the legal system addressed the perpetrator, the loss of Mahmoud's life reverberated through Dangethi, shaping the collective memory of the community and inspiring ongoing efforts to prevent similar acts of violence. The story of Mahmoud Abubakar is remembered not only as a crime, but as a cautionary tale, a reflection on human behavior, responsibility, and the enduring need for accountability. His life, contributions to the community, and the impact of his untimely death continue to resonate in the Maldives, emphasizing the value of justice, the necessity of legal diligence, and the importance of fostering safety and awareness within every community. The case remains a point of reference for law enforcement, policymakers, and residents alike, illustrating both the consequences of violent acts and the societal obligation to respond with rigor, compassion, and vigilance. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Midnight. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep. And until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious,